The auction crowd swelled beneath the scorching Montana sun, their faces slick with sweat and something darker, anticipation. Silver Creek had seen its share of spectacles since the silver rush of '78, but nothing like this. Not a livestock auction or land sale, but something far more primitive. Sheriff Harrison stood on the wooden platform beside a large iron cage covered with canvas. His badge gleamed in the sunlight as he hammered a wooden gavel against the podium. "Folks of Silver Creek," his voice boomed across the town square, "today we bring justice and opportunity in one fell swoop." He gestured dramatically toward the covered cage. "Behind this canvas stands the most dangerous woman in 3 territories." The crowd murmured, necks craning. "3 husbands, 3 bodies," Harrison continued, relishing his role. "They called her Ruthless Ruth. Now, by special arrangement with the territorial governor, instead of hanging, she's being offered for purchase." Which, with a theatrical flourish, Harrison yanked away the canvas. The crowd gasped. Inside stood a woman unlike any they'd seen. Well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad as an ox yoke, she stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. Her hair, wild and dark with threads of silver, framed a face marked by a lifetime of hardship. A jagged scar ran from her left temple to jawline. Her hands, shackled before her, bore the calluses of hard labor. "Who'll start the bidding?" Harrison called. "Remember, gentlemen, you're bidding for ownership. This creature killed 3 men with her bare hands. You'll need to keep her chained, but think of the work she could do, stronger than 2 farmhands." The crowd's reaction was immediate. Jeers, catcalls, and crueler things. "Show us your teeth, beast," someone shouted. "How much to see her hang instead?" called another. Ruth didn't flinch. She might as well have been carved from stone. From the back of the crowd, a man watched in silence. Tobias Granger stood a head taller than most, his weathered face partially hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat. Unlike the excitement animating the others, his eyes held something different: recognition. 45 years of hard living had taught Tobias much about cages, though most weren't made of iron. He'd worn the Union blue during the war, fought at Antietam, where boys from his hometown died screaming in his arms. He'd returned to a hero's welcome and a young wife who looked at him like he'd brought the sun up just for her. Their daughter had her mother's eyes and his stubborn chin. For 8 years he'd known happiness, until the fever took them both in a single merciless week. Now, watching Ruth in her cage, he saw something the others missed. Not a monster, not even anger. Just endurance. The 1,000-yard stare of someone who had survived what should have killed them, and wasn't entirely sure that survival had been a blessing. $5, someone shouted, followed by laughter. 10, if she comes with a muzzle, called another. Sheriff Harrison frowned. "Come now, gentlemen, we're talking about prime labor here. The territorial governor expects at least $50 to cover the expense of her capture." "I'll give you 50, Tobias said, his voice cutting through the noise. The crowd parted, turning to stare at him. At 6'3", with shoulders like oak beams, Tobias commanded attention even when silent. His clothes, though worn, were clean: dark trousers, faded blue shirt, leather vest. The gun at his hip was well maintained, but showed the wear of a tool rather than an ornament. Harrison squinted. "Granger, you serious?" Tobias stepped forward, producing a leather pouch. $50, Silver Creek Ranch money, not promises. "What in tarnation you want with her?" someone called out. "Looking for a mule that fights back?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, but died quickly when Tobias didn't join in. Harrison studied him skeptically. Everyone knew Granger, kept mostly to himself out east near the canyons. No wife since Elizabeth died, no children. His cattle ranch had struggled since the drought, though he still commanded respect. A quiet man, the kind who could go weeks speaking only to his horse. "You understand what you're buying?" Harrison asked. "She's not a regular prisoner. Judge Coleman himself signed the order. She's remanded to custody until death." "I understand," Tobias replied. "There's formalities," Harrison continued, clearly uncomfortable with this turn of events. "She can't just leave with you. She needs to be properly bound by law." "Meaning?" "Meaning she leaves in chains or as a wife. Those are the judge's terms." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several men laughed outright. Tobias didn't hesitate. Then find a preacher. Harrison's eyebrows shot up. You can't be serious, Granger. I don't joke, Tobias answered, his face impassive. I'll take her now, as my wife. Ruth's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of, not hope, something more cautious. Curiosity, perhaps. She's killed 3 men, Harrison repeated slowly, as if Tobias might have misunderstood. So have I, Tobias replied. Mine just wore different uniforms. He stepped closer to the cage, meeting Ruth's gaze directly. Ruth, he said, voice steady, I'm not here to hurt you. She didn't answer, not with words. Her eyes narrowed slightly, assessing him like she might a dangerous animal. Calculating distance, intent, escape routes. Will you come with me? He asked quietly. The question hung in the air, not a demand, not an order. A choice, perhaps the first she'd been offered in years. After what seemed an eternity, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The chapel was nearly empty when they brought her in. Father William stood nervously at the altar, Bible clutched like a shield. 2 deputies flanked Ruth, who remained shackled, though Tobias had insisted they loosen the chains enough for her to walk with dignity. She wore a rough wool cloak borrowed from one of the townswomen, but it hung awkwardly over her frame, unable to hide her height or strength. The ceremony was brief, mechanical. When asked if she took this man, Ruth's voice emerged like something long buried. I do. Just that, 2 words, raspy from disuse. Tobias spoke his part clearly, his deep voice filling the empty space of the chapel. No ring, no kiss, just a ledger signed. 2 names in the suspicious glare of the deputies. She's your responsibility now, Harrison said as they stepped outside. Any trouble, any at all, and it's both of you will hang. Tobias ignored him, helping Ruth onto his wagon. He handed her a blanket against the autumn chill, then untied the horses. It's a day's ride, he said as they left town, every window and doorway filled with staring faces. I'll stop if you need. Ruth didn't speak, just pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The iron manacles had left raw rings around her wrists. She held them in her lap, as though unsure what to do with hands that weren't chained. They traveled in silence as the town disappeared behind them. The road wound through pine forests that gave way to rolling grasslands. The afternoon light turned golden, casting long shadows across the trail. Tobias didn't press conversation, keeping his attention on the horses and the road ahead. It was Ruth who finally broke the silence, her voice still rough. Why? Tobias didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the trail, considering his words carefully. I lost someone, he said finally. Long time ago. I think maybe you did too. Ruth turned away, her jaw tight. For the first time, Tobias saw something crack behind her stoic facade. Not anger, not fear, but grief, ancient, buried deep, and far too heavy for one soul to carry alone. As the sun began to set, the landscape opened up, revealing a valley cut by a small river. In the distance stood Tobias's ranch, modest compared to some, but substantial. A main house built of sturdy logs, a large barn, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. About half the fences showed recent repairs. Others still needed attention. Home, Tobias said simply as they approached. Ruth studied the ranch with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to identify exits and threats before anything else. Tobias stopped the wagon before the house and helped Ruth down. She didn't take his hand, managing on her own, despite the awkward chains. The house was simple but clean, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace dividing them. Tobias had clearly prepared for her arrival. A bed with fresh linen stood in the smaller room, along with a wooden chest and a basin of water. You can take this room, he said, standing in the doorway rather than entering. I've been using it for storage, but cleared it out last week. Ruth looked around slowly like someone who'd forgotten what a home was supposed to be. You can take the bed, Tobias continued. I'll sleep in the barn. No, Ruth said, the word abrupt. It was the first thing she'd said since asking why he'd bought her. Tobias waited, but she offered nothing more. All right, he nodded. I'll be in the main room then. There's water if you want to wash, food when you're ready. He turned to leave. The chains, Ruth said. Tobias paused. I don't have a key. Break them. He considered her request, then nodded. I'll get tools. When he returned with a hammer and chisel, Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, wrists extended. Tobias worked methodically, careful not to hurt her as he broke the locking mechanisms. When the shackles finally fell away, Ruth rubbed her wrists, the skin beneath raw and scarred. "Thank you," she said, the words awkward, as if they were a language she'd nearly forgotten. Tobias simply nodded and left her alone. That night, they ate a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. Ruth ate slowly, methodically, like someone who had learned that food might vanish if not consumed carefully. She sat straight-backed at the table, her movements precise and contained. "You're not scared of me?" she observed finally, looking up from her plate. It wasn't a question. "No," Tobias replied. "Wait, now it was a question. Because I see you, Tobias said quietly, "and I don't see a monster." She studied him for a long moment, as if testing the truth of that statement. Then, seemingly satisfied, or at least not finding the lie she expected, she returned to her meal. They finished eating in silence. In the morning, Tobias woke to find Ruth already outside. She'd collected kindling, milked the cow, and was examining the broken hinge on the barn door when he approached. "You don't have to work," he said. "I do better when I work," she replied simply. The days passed in a rhythm of quiet routine. Ruth didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were careful, precise, as if each one cost her something. Tobias didn't press. He showed her the property, the tools, the ledger for cattle feed. She absorbed it all without complaint, her capable hands quickly learning the ranch's demands. But at night, Tobias sometimes heard her cry. Not loud, not often, but enough to know she carried ghosts. One evening, as the fire crackled low and shadows stretched across the cabin floor, Tobias finally broached the subject that hung between them. "You don't have to tell me," he said. "But if you ever want to talk about what they did to you—" "They didn't do anything to me," she interrupted. Tobias looked up, surprised. "I did it to them," she said, her voice flat. The air between them shifted. Tobias waited, didn't flinch, didn't question. And Ruth looked at him like maybe, just maybe, he was the first man in years who wasn't going to run. The moon rose heavy that night, casting silver light across the plains. In the cabin, the fire had died to embers. Tobias lay on his bedroll, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Ruth's words echoed in his mind. "I did it to them." He hadn't asked what that meant. He hadn't needed to. Her eyes told the rest. Something had broken in her once. Or maybe something had been forged in fire. By dawn, frost covered the ground like fine sugar. Tobias stepped outside, breath clouding in the cold air, and began his morning chores. Halfway through clearing the path to the barn, he heard it, a sharp crack in the distance. A gunshot. Just one. His head snapped toward the ridge beyond the creek. No smoke, no movement, just the echo fading into silence. "Ruth," he called. She was already at the door, rifle in hand, eyes trained in the same direction. She hadn't asked questions. She'd simply reacted. They saddled the horses in silence, Ruth now wearing trousers and a heavy coat from Tobias's stores. They rode toward the sound, following the creek up to where it bent around a stand of cottonwoods. As they crested the hill, they saw it. A wagon with a broken wheel, two bodies on the ground. One still, one moving. Tobias slowed his horse. Ruth rode ahead, dismounting before her horse fully stopped, rifle raised. The man on the ground struggled to rise, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers. Beside him knelt a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, trembling with fear. "Please," the man gasped when he saw Ruth's rifle. "Help us!" Ruth didn't lower her weapon. "What happened?" "Robbers," the girl whispered, wide-eyed. "They shot Pa. Ma's hurt too." Ruth glanced at Tobias, who had dismounted and was checking the still figure in the wagon. A woman, unconscious but breathing. "How many?" Ruth asked. "3 men," the girl said. "They took our money and ran when they heard your horses." Tobias examined the wounded man. "Bullet went clean through. He needs doctoring, but he'll live." Ruth finally lowered her rifle. "Can they be moved?" Tobias nodded. "I'll ride back for the wagon." "No," Ruth said. "I'll stay with them. You go." She glanced around, eyes narrowing. "And hurry." Tobias understood her unspoken concern. The robbers might return. He mounted quickly and rode hard back to the ranch. When he returned with the wagon, Ruth had created a makeshift camp. The wounded man lay propped against the saddle, his shoulder bandaged with torn cloth. The woman had been moved carefully to a pallet of blankets, and the girl sat close to Ruth, watching her tend the fire. Together, they carefully loaded the family into the wagon. The man, who introduced himself as Franklin Morris, drifted in and out of consciousness. His wife Clara remained unresponsive, and their daughter Miriam sat wide-eyed and silent beside Ruth, who drove while Tobias rode alongside. Back at the ranch, they settled the family inside. Ruth gave up her bed without hesitation, helping Clara onto the clean sheets while Tobias and Miriam made Franklin comfortable near the fire. "I'll sleep in the barn," Ruth said that night, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You don't have to," Tobias began. "They need space to heal," she replied simply. That night, Ruth sat outside the barn, rifle across her lap, watching the darkness. Tobias brought her coffee and a blanket, then sat beside her. "You've done this before," he observed. "Tended wounds." Ruth didn't look at him. "When you live with violence, you learn to mend what breaks. The girl trusts you. Children don't judge until they're taught to." They sat in silence for a while, the coffee cooling in their cups. "They'll need to stay until Clara wakes up," Tobias said finally. Ruth nodded. "Franklin's fever will break tomorrow. If we're lucky, the wound is clean." "How do you know?" Ruth finally turned to him. "Because I've seen enough bullet wounds to last 3 lifetimes." Tobias didn't press further. He simply nodded and returned to the house, leaving Ruth to her vigil. Over the next days, Franklin's condition improved. Clara regained consciousness, though she remained weak. Miriam, resilient as children often are, began to explore the ranch, always returning to Ruth's side like a shadow. One morning, Ruth was chopping wood when she noticed Miriam watching from the porch steps. "You got questions," Ruth said, embedding the axe in the chopping block. Miriam nodded. "Sam, why don't you talk much?" the girl said immediately. Ruth considered this, wiping sweat from her brow. "Because most folks hear what they want, not what you say." Miriam tilted her head. "Do you hate people?" "No," Ruth answered after a moment, "but I don't trust easy." "Did someone hurt you?" Ruth hesitated, then glanced toward the hills. "A lot of someone's." Miriam reached out and took Ruth's hand, just for a second, and Ruth, to her own surprise, didn't pull away. That night, after the Morris family had eaten and gone to sleep, Tobias found Ruth by the barn, staring at the stars. "You're different with them," he observed. She raised an eyebrow. "You just noticing?" "No, I mean since they came, you speak more." Ruth leaned against the post. "They needed help. You didn't used to be the helping kind." "I wasn't used to being helped." Tobias considered that. "You've got away with that girl. She reminds me of someone." "Who?" Ruth didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she stepped inside the barn, crossed to a covered crate, and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small wooden horse, carved with delicate care. "I had a son," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. "Isaac, he was 6. Tobias said nothing. He waited. "We were running," she continued. "His father, he thought owning meant breaking. When I left, he followed. Said he'd take Isaac to punish me." Her fist clenched. "He did." The silence that followed was the kind that bends souls. Not awkward, not cruel, just a weight. The kind of silence that holds your heart in its grip and doesn't let go. "I killed him," Ruth said at last. "I killed the man who killed my son and the 2 others who tried to stop me. That's what I meant." Tobias stepped forward slowly, carefully. "You survived," he said. Ruth looked at him, tears burning down her cheeks. "No," she whispered. "I didn't. I died back there. I just forgot to stop breathing." Tobias didn't touch her, didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. He just stood there beside her, silent, steady, and for the first time since the cage, Ruth wept. Not the quiet tears of fear or rage, but the sobs of a woman who hadn't been allowed to grieve, who had held on too long for too many reasons. She cried until she had nothing left to give. Then she slept, curled on a pile of hay, the wooden horse clutched in her scarred hand. Tobias kept watch through the night. Dawn was just breaking when they heard the approaching horses. Tobias, who had dozed against the barn door, jerked awake. Ruth was already on her feet, rifle in hand. "How many?" she whispered. "4, maybe 5, Tobias replied, peering through a crack in the boards, coming slow. Ruth's face hardened. "It's him." "Who?" "The judge." Coleman. Her voice was flat, emotionless. The one who put me in the cage. Tobias watched as 5 riders approached the ranch house. The lead rider was immediately distinguishable. Older, well-dressed in a fine coat and hat, sitting straight-backed on a gleaming black stallion. Beside him rode 4 men who could only be hired guns, their expressions hard beneath their hat brims. "Stay here," Tobias said, moving toward the door. Ruth caught his arm, her grip like iron. "No, he's seen worse than me." She met his gaze, her eyes hard. "But he's never seen me free." Together they stepped out into the morning light. Judge Victor Coleman reined in his horse, surveying the ranch with the practiced eye of a man who evaluated property, all property, in terms of its value to him. When his gaze fell on Ruth, something shifted in his expression. Not fear exactly, something more like annoyance, tinged with satisfaction. "Well, well," he said, his voice cultured, controlled. "If it isn't the infamous Ruth Mercer. Or is it Granger now, I hear?" Tobias stepped forward. "Judge Coleman, this is private property." Coleman smiled thinly. "Indeed it is. That's precisely why I'm here." He removed his hat, revealing silver hair and cold blue eyes. "I've come to discuss a business proposition, Mr. Granger, one that could be quite lucrative for you." His gaze slid back to Ruth, who stood unflinching beneath his scrutiny. "Though I see you've already acquired quite an unusual asset." Tobias stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Ruth and Coleman. "Whatever business you have, you can state it plainly." Coleman's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Very well. I've been authorized by the Montana Central Railroad to acquire land for a new line. Your property sits on the most direct route from Silver Creek to Fort Benton." He gestured broadly. "I'm prepared to offer you twice its market value, cash." "Not interested," Tobias replied without hesitation. Coleman's smile tightened. "Mr. Granger, perhaps you misunderstand. This isn't merely a personal proposition. The railroad brings prosperity, jobs, the future." His gaze shifted to Ruth. "And I imagine a man in your unusual situation might appreciate a fresh start elsewhere." Ruth's hand tightened on her rifle, but she remained silent, her face impassive. "My answer stands," Tobias said. "This land isn't for sale. Not to you, not to the railroad." Coleman studied him for a long moment, then sighed dramatically. "I had hoped you'd be reasonable." He replaced his hat, adjusting it with practiced precision. "But I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. A man who'd chain himself to a killer isn't known for sound judgment." "I'm not chained to anyone," Tobias replied evenly, "and neither is she." Coleman's eyebrows rose. "No, Icky." His gaze shifted to Ruth, cold amusement in his eyes. "You've unchained the beast, then? How very progressive." He clicked his tongue. "Sheriff Harrison will be most interested to hear that." "Well, say what you came in to say, then leave." Ruth spoke for the first time, her voice low but clear. Something dangerous flashed across Coleman's face, a momentary crack in his composed veneer. "I see prison didn't teach you respect," he said softly. "Pity." He straightened in his saddle, addressing Tobias again. "My offer stands for 1 week. After that, I cannot guarantee its generosity." He looked pointedly at the Morris family, now watching from the doorway, "or the safety of those under your protection." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following in tight formation. Tobias watched them go, a cold knot forming in his stomach. When they had disappeared over the ridge, he turned to Ruth. "You know him? Beyond the cage." It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "All of us." Stayan. That evening, with the children asleep and Clara resting, Ruth, Tobias, and Franklin gathered around the kitchen table. A single oil lamp cast long shadows across their faces as Ruth spoke, her voice low and steady, each word measured as if pulled from deep within. "I was born in Tennessee, 18 more. Mother died birthing me. Father sold me to my first husband when I was 17. She stared at her hands, spread flat on the table. "His name was Caleb Vance. He owned a lumber mill, preferred his fists to words." Franklin shifted uncomfortably, but Tobias remained still, his eyes never leaving Ruth's face. "I had a son, Isaac." Her voice softened on the name. "When he was 6, I tried to run. Caleb caught us near the Kentucky border." She swallowed hard. He killed Isaac to punish me. Said if he couldn't have his son, neither would I. Clara gasped softly from the bedroom doorway. No one had noticed her rise from bed. I killed him, Ruth continued, her voice flat again. Then I ran, changed my name to Mercer, worked as a midwife in Missouri for almost 2 years before Victor Coleman arrived. The judge, Tobias clarified. Ruth nodded. He wasn't a judge then, just a wealthy man with political ambitions. His wife was expecting their first child. There were complications. Her eyes grew distant. I couldn't save her or the baby. Coleman blamed me, had me arrested for murder. That's not right, Clara said, moving slowly to join them at the table. Childbirth isn't murder. It is when the right people say so, Ruth replied. Coleman had influence. I had nothing. How did you end up in Montana? Franklin asked. Ruth's expression hardened. Coleman arranged to have me released into his custody. Said he'd show mercy, give me a chance to repay my debt. Her mouth twisted bitterly. He brought me west as his housekeeper. In reality, I was his prisoner, his property. Understanding dawned on Clara's face. Dear God. I endured for almost a year, Ruth continued. Then I discovered his secret. His first wife hadn't died from childbirth complications. He'd been poisoning her slowly. I found the arsenic. When I confronted him, he admitted it. Said she'd become an embarrassment. Unstable. And you ran, Tobias guessed. Ruth nodded. With evidence of his crime, that's when he became a judge, using his connections to gain authority, to hunt me legally. He put a bounty on my head. Said I'd killed his wife and tried to kill him. She looked up at Tobias. That's why he's here. Not for your land, for me. Her eyes held his, and for what I know. Tobias processed this, his weathered face betraying little emotion. Did you keep the evidence? I hid it, Ruth admitted, before I was captured. A ledger with dates, amounts, notes in his own hand. She glanced toward the window as if measuring distance. It's still there if no one's found it. Where? Franklin asked. Ruth hesitated, then shook her head. Safer if I'm the only one who knows. Clara reached across the table and took Ruth's hand. The gesture was so unexpected that Ruth almost pulled away. We'll help you, Clara said firmly. You saved our lives. Now we'll help save yours. Tobias nodded agreement. Coleman won't stop, not until he has what he wants. He met Ruth's eyes. And neither will we. For the first time in years, Ruth felt something dangerous stir within her chest. Hope. Dawn found Tobias in the barn, methodically cleaning his rifle. He didn't look up when Ruth entered, but he felt her presence, solid, watchful. You should have told me sooner, he said, still focused on his task. Would it have changed anything? She asked. Tobias considered this, then shook his head. No, but I'd have been better prepared. For what? War with a judge? Ruth leaned against the doorframe. There's no winning that fight, Tobias. He finally looked up, his eyes hard with determination. I'm not looking to win, just to survive. He set the rifle aside. And I'm not alone. Ruth studied him, trying to understand this man who'd stepped into her life so unexpectedly. Why are you doing this? The truth this time. Tobias was silent for a long moment. Then, I was a lawman once after the war, sheriff in a small town in Colorado. This surprised her. What happened? There was a woman, Margaret Kelly. Her husband beat her regularly, everyone knew it. His voice grew tight. I tried to help, warned him, arrested him a few times. But the law, it didn't protect women like her. Not really. Ruth waited, sensing there was more. One night he went too far, killed her and their little girl, then himself. Tobias's hands clenched on the rifle. I was too late, always too late. So I'm your redemption? Ruth asked, a edge in her voice. No, Tobias replied, meeting her gaze directly. You're a reminder that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. He stood, holstering his pistol. I couldn't save Margaret, but I can help you. Not because I need saving, but because it's right. Ruth absorbed this, then nodded once. Fair enough. Tobias picked up the rifle. Coleman will come back, likely with the law behind him this time. He offered the weapon to her. Can you still shoot? A ghost of a smile touched Ruth's lips. Some things you don't forget. Over the next 2 weeks, they prepared. Tobias reinforced the house, adding shutters that could be barred from inside. Franklin, now recovering, helped construct a hidden cellar beneath the barn floor, a refuge if things went badly. Ruth taught Clara to shoot, surprised at how quickly the quiet woman took to it. I had brothers, Clara explained, hitting a can at 30 paces. They didn't think girls should handle guns, so I learned when they weren't looking. Meanwhile, Miriam shadowed Ruth everywhere, absorbing knowledge like dry earth takes rain, how to identify edible plants, how to move silently through the woods, how to read weather from cloud patterns. Ruth found herself warming to the child's endless curiosity. Why do you hide your hair? Miriam asked one day as Ruth braided her long, dark mane tightly against her scalp. Hair can be grabbed, Ruth answered matter-of-factly. In a fight, anything that can be grabbed is a weakness. Miriam considered this seriously. Will you teach me to fight too? Ruth paused, studying the small, determined face before her. Why do you want to learn? So no one can hurt us again, Miriam replied simply. Ruth felt something tighten in her chest. Some fights can't be won with fists or guns, she said softly. Sometimes the strongest thing is knowing when to walk away. Is that what you did? Walked away? No, Ruth admitted, but I wish I had, before it was too late. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived. The sound of approaching hoofbeats brought everyone to alert, weapons ready. But it was a single rider, Sheriff Harrison from Silver Creek, alone and looking distinctly uncomfortable. Granger, he called from a safe distance. I come in peace. Need to talk. Tobias met him at the edge of the property, rifle casually but visibly present. What brings you out this way, Sheriff? Harrison dismounted, dust from the trail coating his usually immaculate uniform. Judge Coleman's filed papers, he said without preamble. Says your wife escaped legal custody, that your marriage isn't valid. That's so? Tobias's voice remained neutral. He's demanding her return to Silver Creek for a proper trial. Harrison looked genuinely troubled. Wanted to warn you, he's got 20 men coming, deputies from 3 counties. Tobias studied the sheriff's face. Why tell me this? You work for him. Harrison removed his hat, revealing thinning hair and a deeply lined face. I work for the law, Granger, and lately I'm not sure Coleman does the same. He glanced toward the house where Ruth stood watching. Don't know what happened between them. Don't want to know. But a man who needs 20 guns to arrest one woman isn't seeking justice. When? Tomorrow, noon. Harrison replaced his hat. That's all I came to say. As he turned to leave, Tobias called after him. Why risk this, Harrison? The sheriff paused. My sister was murdered by her husband 10 years back. Judge ruled it an accident. His eyes hardened. It was Coleman. With that, he mounted and rode away. We need to leave, Franklin urged that night. All of us. Now. They had gathered in the barn, speaking in hushed tones despite being far from any listening ears. The news of Coleman's approaching force had galvanized them into action. We can't outrun 20 men, Tobias countered, not with Clara still weak and Miriam to protect. Then Ruth and I go, Franklin suggested. Draw them away while you take the women somewhere safe. Ruth shook her head. Coleman won't stop with me. He wants no witnesses. She looked at Clara. He'll hunt you all if he thinks you know about the ledger. Then we fight, Clara said unexpectedly. The others turned to her in surprise. What? You think because I'm a woman I can't make that choice? We're already in this. Together. Tobias considered their options. Harrison's warning gives us time. Not much, but some. He turned to Ruth. Where's the ledger? If we can get it, use it against Coleman. It's 100 miles from here, Ruth interrupted. Near the old Blackwater mining camp where I was captured. That's 3 days' hard ride, Tobias frowned. We don't have that kind of time. A commotion outside interrupted their counsel. The sound of hooves, multiple riders approaching fast. Too soon for Coleman's men, unless Harrison had betrayed them. They moved quickly, Franklin gathering Miriam and Clara into the hidden cellar while Tobias and Ruth took up defensive positions. Through the barn's small window, they watched as 3 riders approached, silhouetted against the setting sun. Friends of yours? Ruth whispered. Tobias shook his head, tension evident in his posture. No one I recognize. The lead rider dismounted first, a tall, lean man in a dust-covered duster. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but when he looked up toward the barn, Ruth inhaled sharply. "What is it?" Tobias asked. "I know him," she breathed. "Samuel Morgan. He was a blacksmith in Coleman's town. He helped me escape." Before Tobias could respond, Ruth stepped out from cover, rifle lowered but ready. "Samuel?" she called. The man froze, then pushed back his hat. A weathered face with a prominent scar, running from temple to jaw, broke into a relieved smile. "Ruth, by God, you're alive!" Minutes later, they had crowded back into the barn. Samuel Morgan proved to be a man of few words but direct purpose. His companions, brothers named James and William Hayes, were equally taciturn. "Coleman's put a price on all our heads," Samuel explained, his voice a low rumble. "500 for you, Ruth. 200 each for us." He grimaced. "We've been running 6 months. Then we heard talk in Butte. A giant woman spotted with a rancher east of Silver Creek. Knew it had to be you." "How'd you find us?" Tobias asked, still wary. "Wasn't hard. Asked about a tall rancher with a taller wife." Samuel glanced at Ruth. "You tend to make an impression." Ruth allowed herself a small smile. "It's good to see you, Samuel." "Harrison came by earlier," Tobias explained. "Says Coleman's bringing 20 men tomorrow." Samuel nodded grimly. "That tracks. He's been gathering hired guns, former soldiers mostly, mean ones." "We need the ledger," Ruth said. "It's the only way to stop him permanently." "The one with the poison records?" Samuel asked. When Ruth nodded, he sighed. "It's a long ride to Blackwater." "Too long," Tobias agreed. "We can't get there and back before Coleman arrives." William Hayes spoke up for the first time, his voice surprisingly soft for such a big man. "Maybe you don't have to." All eyes turned to him. "If Coleman's bringing his men here, his house will be empty." A moment of silence fell as the implications sank in. "You think he has another copy of the ledger?" Ruth asked. "A man like that keeps records," Samuel said slowly. "Insurance. It's worth trying," James Hayes added. "Better odds than facing 20 guns." Tobias considered this. "A diversion, then. Ruth stays here with Franklin and Clara, visible, so Coleman believes we're making a stand. Meanwhile, Samuel and I ride for Coleman's house." "No," Ruth shook her head firmly. "I'm going after the ledger. I know what we're looking for." "Ruth," Tobias began, "I won't hide while others fight my battles." She cut him off. "Not anymore." Their eyes locked in silent argument. Finally, Tobias nodded. "All right, you and Samuel go. The Hayes brothers stay with us to bolster our defense." "What about Miriam?" Ruth asked, her voice softening. "She shouldn't be here when Coleman comes." "The Mission Church in Rock Springs," Samuel suggested, "about 15 miles north. Father Thomas there is no friend to Coleman. He'd shelter the child." Clara emerged from the cellar entrance. "I heard. I'll take her tonight." The plan took shape quickly after that. Clara would leave with Miriam before dawn, heading north to the mission. Ruth and Samuel would ride for Silver Creek under cover of darkness, aiming to search Coleman's house while he led his men east. Tobias, Franklin, and the Hayes brothers would create the illusion of preparations for a siege, ensuring Coleman believed Ruth was still at the ranch. As the others finalized details, Ruth stepped outside, needing a moment alone. The night was clear, stars scattered like salt across the black sky. She heard Tobias's footsteps behind her, but didn't turn. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," she replied, "I do." "Why?" She considered the question, her eyes on the distant horizon. "Because for years I've been running, hiding, surviving." She finally looked at him. "I want to live, Tobias, really live." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Be careful." "You too." She hesitated, then added, "If I don't come back." "You will," he interrupted firmly. Ruth studied his face in the moonlight, memorizing its lines and angles. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me." Before he could respond, she turned and walked back to the barn, shoulders straight, steps purposeful. Ruth and Samuel rode through the night, keeping to less traveled paths. Dawn found them in a dense pine forest 5 miles from Silver Creek, waiting for full daylight before approaching town. Samuel had exchanged his distinctive duster for a plain work shirt, and Ruth wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, her height disguised by a slouched posture in the saddle. Coleman's house is on the north edge of town, Samuel explained as they rested the horses. Big white place with columns. Hard to miss. Guards, Ruth asked. Usually two, but if he's taken most of his men, then we might get lucky, she finished. Samuel studied her face. You've changed, he observed. Ruth raised an eyebrow. How so? You speak more. Look people in the eye. He smiled slightly. The Ruth I knew would have planned this alone. She considered this. I had no one to trust before. And now? Ruth didn't answer immediately. Now I have something to lose, she said finally. They approached Silver Creek from the north, avoiding the main road. Coleman's house stood as Samuel had described, an ostentatious white mansion with pillars flanking the front entrance, set apart from the more modest buildings of the town. It overlooked Silver Creek from a small hill, its windows gleaming in the morning sun like watchful eyes. Ruth and Samuel left their horses hidden in a grove of trees and advanced on foot, moving cautiously through the underbrush. As they reached the edge of the manicured grounds, Samuel signaled for a halt. Something's wrong, he whispered. Ruth followed his gaze. The house appeared quiet, too quiet. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No servants moved about the grounds. The stable stood empty, doors ajar. Could be a trap, Samuel murmured. Or he took everyone with him, Ruth countered. They watched for another 10 minutes, seeing no movement. Finally, Ruth had made a decision. I'm going in. Cover me. Before Samuel could object, she moved forward, keeping low and using the ornamental shrubs for cover. She reached the back of the house without incident, finding the kitchen door unlocked. Another oddity. Drawing her pistol, she slipped inside. The kitchen was cold, the hearth empty. Dishes sat unwashed in a basin, food half prepared on the cutting board. Ruth moved silently through the house, alert for any sound. The main floor was deserted, furniture draped with sheets as if prepared for a long absence. She ascended the grand staircase, wincing at a creaking step. The upper floor contained several bedrooms, all similarly abandoned. At the end of the hall stood a heavy oak door, Coleman's study presumably. Ruth tried the handle, locked. Returning downstairs, she signaled Samuel to join her. Empty, she reported as he entered. Completely, like they left in a hurry. Samuel frowned. That doesn't make sense. Coleman wouldn't leave his property unguarded. Unless he had something more important to protect, Ruth reasoned. His study's locked. Can you open it? Samuel nodded, following her upstairs. The lock proved no match for his skills, yielding with a soft click after less than a minute's work. Coleman's study was a testament to his self-importance. Leather-bound books lining the walls, a massive desk dominating the center, and hunting trophies mounted on every available surface. Ruth immediately began searching, pulling open drawers and checking behind books. What exactly are we looking for? Samuel asked, joining the search. A small leather journal, black with gold corners. Ruth ran her fingers along the edge of the desk, checking for hidden compartments. Sarah, his wife, kept detailed records of everything: dates, amounts of arsenic, symptoms. They searched methodically, growing increasingly frustrated as minutes ticked by. The desk yielded nothing, nor did the bookcase or the ornate cabinet in the corner. It's not here, Samuel finally said, wiping sweat from his brow. Ruth refused to give up, running her hands along the wainscoting, testing floorboards. It has to be. He wouldn't destroy it. It's his insurance. Against what? His partners, Ruth replied, pushing against a section of paneling. Coleman wasn't working alone. There were others, politicians, businessmen. They protected him. She paused suddenly, noticing a faint discoloration on the wooden floor beneath the bearskin rug. Pulling the rug aside, she revealed a small trapdoor, nearly invisible against the surrounding floorboards. Samuel, she called softly. Together they lifted the trapdoor, revealing a small compartment containing a strongbox. Samuel produced a set of picks from his pocket. This'll take longer, he warned. Ruth nodded, keeping watch at the door while he worked. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour before the lock finally surrendered with a satisfying click. Inside lay several documents: land deeds, letters, banknotes, and beneath them, a small black leather journal exactly as Ruth had described. This is it, she breathed, flipping through the pages. Sarah Coleman's delicate handwriting detailed her husband's methodical poisoning, dates and doses recorded with painful precision. The final entry, dated just days before her supposed death, read, "He thinks I don't know, but I do. God forgive me for not being stronger." Ruth closed the journal, a mixture of vindication and sorrow washing over her. "We need to go," she said, slipping it into her shirt. "Now." As they descended the stairs, a sound from the front of the house froze them in place. The unmistakable creak of the front door opening, followed by footsteps. "Back door," Samuel mouthed. They crept toward the kitchen, but before they could reach it, a voice called out, "I know you're here." The voice was female, elderly, and surprisingly calm. "I saw you from the garden." Ruth and Samuel exchanged glances, weapons ready. Slowly they moved toward the voice, finding an old woman standing in the entrance hall. She wore the plain dress of a housekeeper, her white hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Mrs. Holloway," Samuel whispered in recognition. The old woman's eyes widened slightly. "Samuel Morgan, I thought you were dead." Her gaze shifted to Ruth and a small smile touched her lips. "And Ruth Mercer. Well, well." "Where is everyone?" Ruth asked cautiously. "Gone," Mrs. Holloway replied simply. "The judge took all the men, sent the rest of the staff away yesterday." She studied them with shrewd eyes. "You found it, didn't you? Sarah's journal." Ruth tensed. "You knew?" "I've been in this house 30 years, child. I know its secrets." The old woman sighed heavily. "And its ghosts." "You should leave," Samuel advised. "It's not safe here anymore." Mrs. Holloway chuckled dryly. "At my age, nowhere is safe." She stepped aside, clearing their path to the door. "Go. Do what needs doing." As they moved past her, Ruth paused. Did she suffer? At the end? The old woman's eyes clouded. Not as much as he wanted her to. Ruth nodded, understanding the implication. "Thank you." They had nearly reached their horses when the sound of approaching riders sent them diving for cover. From their hiding place in the underbrush, they watched as 3 men galloped up to Coleman's house. They weren't Coleman's usual men. These wore the distinctive duster coats of professional bounty hunters. "The Raven," Samuel breathed, recognizing the lead rider. "Who?" Ruth whispered. "Julian Miller. They call him the Raven, deadliest tracker west of the Mississippi." Samuel's face was grim. "If Coleman hired him, we're in trouble." They watched as the bounty hunters entered the house, emerging minutes later with Mrs. Holloway between them. The old woman was speaking animatedly, pointing north, away from the direction Ruth and Samuel had taken. "She's buying us time," Ruth realized. "We need to use it," Samuel replied. "Those men won't be fooled for long." They mounted quickly, taking a circuitous route south before turning west toward Tobias's ranch. The journal was secure against Ruth's chest, its weight both burden and promise. As they rode, a plan began to form in her mind, not just for survival, but for justice. By midday, they had covered significant ground, stopping to rest the horses at a small creek. Ruth removed the journal from her shirt, studying it again. "This name's names," she said, showing Samuel a particularly detailed page. "Judges, bankers, even a senator, all complicit in covering up Sarah's murder." Samuel whistled low. No wonder Coleman's desperate to find it. "This is bigger than just me," Ruth realized. It always was. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the quiet, the bullet splintering bark inches from Ruth's head. They dove for cover as more shots followed, coming from the ridge above them. "The Raven," Samuel confirmed grimly, returning fire. "They must have picked up our trail." Ruth assessed their situation, pinned down, outnumbered, with limited ammunition. "We need to split up," she decided. "I'll draw them off. You take the journal to Tobias." "No," Samuel objected. "They want you, Ruth." "Exactly, which is why they'll follow me." She pressed the journal into his hands. "This is more important than either of us. Get it to Tobias. Tell him to take it to the federal marshal in Fort Benton." Samuel hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "What will you do?" Ruth checked her pistol. "Lead them on a chase they won't forget." Her eyes met his. "Then circle back to the ranch. Coleman will be there by now." Another volley of shots forced them lower. Ruth pointed to a dense thicket to their left. "When I start shooting, you go. Stay low. Keep to the trees." Samuel gripped her arm. "Ruth, I'll be fine," she assured him, though they both knew it might be a lie. "Now go." Ruth waited until Samuel was positioned, then rose slightly and fired 3 rapid shots toward the ridge. As return fire concentrated on her position, Samuel broke cover, sprinting for the thicket. Ruth continued firing, drawing the bounty hunter's attention until she was certain Samuel had escaped. Then, with a deep breath, she mounted her horse and burst from cover, riding hard in the opposite direction from Samuel. As she'd predicted, the bounty hunters gave chase, hooves thundering behind her. Ruth rode recklessly, pushing her mount to its limits, leading her pursuers deeper into unfamiliar territory. She crossed streams, doubled back, used every trick she knew to confuse her trail. But the raven wasn't easily deceived. By late afternoon, Ruth realized he was still on her trail, closer than before. Her horse was tiring, foam flecking its neck. She needed a new strategy. Ahead, the terrain grew rockier, a series of bluffs rising from the plains. Ruth guided her mount toward them, seeking higher ground and a defensible position. As she crested a narrow ridge, she spotted what she needed, a natural stone arch spanning a deep ravine. Dismounting, she led her exhausted horse across the arch, then sent it running on the other side with a sharp slap to its flank. Taking position behind a boulder, rifle ready, she waited. The raven appeared first, tracking her with uncanny precision. He reined in his horse at the sight of the stone arch, studying it and the terrain beyond with experienced eyes. His companions joined him moments later. "She crossed here," the raven stated with certainty. "Recently." "That's a long drop," one of his men observed nervously, peering into the ravine below. "Her horse went over," the raven noted, pointing to fresh tracks on the other side. "But where is she?" Ruth held her breath, finger on the trigger. The raven dismounted, approaching the arch on foot. He moved with the caution of a man who had survived countless ambushes, his eyes scanning the rocks around him. When he reached the middle of the arch, Ruth made her move, not firing but standing, revealing herself. "Looking for me?" she called. The raven turned slowly, unsurprised. His men raised their rifles, but he motioned them to hold. "Ruth Mercer," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "You've led us quite a chase." "It ends here," she replied, rifle steady. The raven regarded her with something like professional admiration. "Does it? You're outnumbered. Outgunned." "Maybe," Ruth acknowledged, "but you'll be the first to die." A tense silence stretched between them. Then unexpectedly, the raven smiled. "Coleman said you were dangerous. He didn't mention brave." "What do you want?" Ruth demanded. "Originally, the bounty on your head." The raven took a step forward. "But now I'm curious. What makes a woman worth hunting with such dedication?" "Ask Coleman." "I did. He says you're a murderer, a thief." The raven tilted his head. "But men like Coleman, they lie as easily as they breathe." Ruth studied him, trying to understand his angle. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying perhaps we should talk." The raven glanced at the drop beneath his feet, somewhere less precarious. Before Ruth could respond, the sound of distant gunfire reached them, many guns, from the direction of Tobias's ranch. "It started," the raven observed. "Coleman's attack on your friends." Ruth's heart clenched. "Then we have nothing to talk about." "On the contrary," the raven's eyes narrowed. "We have everything to talk about, including how to stop Coleman permanently." "Why would you help me?" Ruth demanded. The raven reached slowly into his coat, producing a small object that glinted in the sunlight. He held it up for her to see, a child's wooden toy horse, intricately carved. "Because," he said quietly, "I believe this belongs to you." Ruth froze, recognition and disbelief warring on her face. "Where did you get that?" "From a boy named Isaac," the raven replied. "A boy who isn't dead after all." Ruth stared at the wooden horse in the raven's hand, her world tilting beneath her. The toy was unmistakable. She had carved it herself, whittling away hours during her pregnancy, her hopes for her son taking shape beneath her knife. The grain of the wood, the slight imperfection in the right foreleg where her blade had slipped, the tiny initials I M carved underneath, all exactly as she remembered. "You're lying," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant gunfire. "Isaac is dead. I saw—" "You saw a child," the raven, Julian Miller, replied calmly. "Not necessarily your child." Ruth's rifle wavered. "Explain, now." Julian gestured to the precarious arch beneath his feet. Perhaps somewhere more conducive to conversation? With reluctance, Ruth nodded. Julian signaled his men to stay back, then crossed the arch alone, movements deliberate and controlled. Ruth kept her rifle trained on him until he reached solid ground, then backed away to maintain distance. "Speak," she demanded. "7 years ago," Julian began, "I was hired to track a runaway. Not you, a house servant from Coleman's estate. She had stolen something valuable," Coleman claimed. His weathered face revealed nothing. "I found her near the Kentucky border. She was traveling with a boy." Ruth's breath caught. "What was her name?" Mary Tanner." The name hit Ruth like a blow. "Mary was my friend. She helped me when Isaac was born." Julian nodded. "She told me everything. How Coleman had killed his wife. How you discovered the truth and fled with evidence. How Coleman's men caught you near the border." His voice softened slightly. "She said they killed a child to punish you, but it wasn't your son." Ruth shook her head in disbelief. "I saw Isaac's body." "You saw a body," Julian corrected. "In the chaos and grief, would you have noticed if it wasn't him?" "Coleman's men grabbed the first child they found, Mary's son. She had run to warn you, bringing her boy along." "No," Ruth whispered, but doubt had crept in. The memory was fragmented, distorted by trauma. A small body, face down, blood-soaked clothes. She had never turned him over, never looked at his face. Coleman's men had dragged her away too quickly. "Mary escaped with Isaac," Julian continued, "changed his name, raised him as her own until consumption took her 3 years ago. He offered the wooden horse. The boy kept this, said it was from his real mother." Ruth took the toy with trembling hands. "Where is he now?" "With Coleman." Her head snapped up. "What?" "Coleman discovered he survived about a year ago, had him brought to Silver Creek, told him you abandoned him." Julian's expression hardened. "He's using the boy as leverage, insurance, in case you ever resurfaced with the evidence." The distant gunfire intensified. Ruth glanced toward the sound, torn between disbelief and desperate hope. "Why tell me this?" she demanded. "Why help me?" Julian considered his answer carefully. "I've spent 20 years hunting people for men like Coleman, following orders, asking no questions." His eyes met hers. "Mary Tanner made me question. Your son made me see. If you're lying, I'm not." He gestured toward the gunfire. "Coleman brought the boy to the ranch, said seeing you captured would bring closure to his trauma." Ruth's mind raced, possibilities and dangers unfurling like a map. If Isaac truly lived, if he was at the ranch. "I need proof," she said finally, "before I trust you." Julian nodded, reaching into his coat to produce a folded paper. "Isaac drew this a month ago. Coleman showed it to me as proof of the boy's identity." Ruth unfolded the paper with unsteady fingers. The drawing was crude but unmistakable. A tall woman with long, dark hair holding a wooden horse. Beneath it, in childish script, "My real mama." Something broke inside her, a dam of grief held for 7 years. "He remembers me," she whispered. "Bits and pieces," Julian confirmed. "Coleman's been poisoning his mind against you, but children know truth from lies better than most." Ruth folded the paper carefully, tucking it inside her shirt next to her heart. "What's your plan?" "Coleman expects me to bring you in," Julian explained. "My men are loyal to money, not causes. They'll report back that you died in the ravine." He gestured to his companions, still waiting across the arch. "Meanwhile, you and I approach the ranch from the west. The battle will provide cover. And Samuel, my friend with the journal? If he's smart, he's well away by now." Ruth considered her options. Trust this man, a bounty hunter, a stranger, on the slimmest hope that her son lived, or reject his story and lose perhaps her only chance to reach the ranch in time? In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. "Lead the way," she said. Tobias crouched behind the overturned wagon, sweat stinging his eyes as he reloaded his rifle. Beside him, Franklin pressed a bandage to his bleeding arm, face pale but determined. "How many you count?" Franklin asked through gritted teeth. "At least 15, Tobias replied, chambering around. "Maybe more circling, behind." The Hayes brothers had taken positions in the barn, providing covering fire that had already claimed 3 of Coleman's men. But the attackers had come prepared, with rifles that outrange their own and enough ammunition to sustain the siege for hours. Coleman himself remained safely behind his men, mounted on his black stallion, occasionally calling out demands for Ruth's surrender. "We can't hold them much longer," Franklin warned, peering through a gap in the wagon boards. "They're working their way to the east side." Tobias knew he was right. The plan had been for Ruth and Samuel to return before Coleman's attack, bringing the evidence that might stop this bloodshed. But they were hours overdue now, and hope was fading with the afternoon light. A bullet splintered wood inches from Tobias's head. He ducked lower, mind racing. They needed to reach the house. Better cover, more ammunition, and access to the cellar if things went completely sideways. "On my signal," he told Franklin, "we make for the house. Hayes brothers will cover us." Franklin nodded grimly, checking his pistol. Tobias waited for a lull in the shooting, then fired 3 rapid shots as a signal to the Hayes brothers. Immediately, concentrated fire erupted from the barn, forcing Coleman's men to seek cover. "Now!" Tobias shouted. They sprinted across the open ground, bullets kicking up dirt around their feet. Franklin stumbled once, but kept going. They had nearly reached the porch when Tobias heard Coleman's voice ring out. "Enough! Hold your fire!" The sudden silence was more unnerving than the gunfire. Tobias pushed Franklin toward the door, then turned, rifle ready. Coleman rode forward, flanked by 2 gunmen. But what froze Tobias's blood was the small figure seated before Coleman on his horse. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, dark-haired and solemn-faced. "Mr. Granger," Coleman called, his cultured voice carrying easily across the yard. "I believe we can resolve this situation more civilly." "By using a child as a shield," Tobias replied, disgust evident in his tone. Coleman smiled thinly. "Not a shield, a motivation." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is Isaac, Ruth's son." Tobias kept his expression neutral, though his mind reeled. Ruth's son? The boy she believed dead? "Ruth isn't here," he called back. "Your men have been dying for nothing." "I don't believe you," Coleman replied smoothly, "but it hardly matters. She'll come for the boy." His smile widened. Maternal instinct is so predictable. The boy, Isaac, sat rigidly, his eyes scanning the ranch with an intensity that reminded Tobias painfully of Ruth. "What do you want?" Tobias demanded. "A simple exchange, the journal for the boy. Ruth's freedom for his life." Coleman stroked Isaac's hair in a gesture of false affection that made Tobias's skin crawl. "Surely that's reasonable?" Before Tobias could respond, a voice rang out from the ridge to the west. "Let him go, Victor." All heads turned. Ruth stood silhouetted against the setting sun, rifle in hand. Beside her was a tall man Tobias didn't recognize. The Raven, he presumed. "Ah, Ruth," Coleman called, visibly pleased. "Punctual as ever. I was just explaining the terms to your friend." Ruth began descending the ridge, each step deliberate. The man beside her remained where he was, rifle trained on Coleman. "There are no terms," Ruth replied, her voice carrying across the ranch yard. "Just justice." "Justice?" Coleman laughed. "My dear, justice is determined by those with power. Always has been." He tightened his grip on Isaac, who winced. "And right now, power sits with me." Ruth reached the bottom of the ridge, stopping 30 yards from Coleman. For the first time, Isaac saw her clearly. His eyes widened, recognition and confusion warring on his young face. "Hello, Isaac," Ruth said softly, lowering her rifle slightly. "Do you remember me?" The boy nodded hesitantly. "From my dreams. You sang to me." Coleman's face tightened. "Enough sentimentality. The journal, Ruth, now." "I don't have it," she replied evenly. "Then the boy dies." Coleman pulled a small pistol from his coat, pressing it to Isaac's temple. "He's your insurance," Ruth countered, taking another step forward. "Kill him, and you have nothing." Coleman's face flushed with anger. "Don't test me, Ruth. My patience has limits." "So does mine." Ruth laid down her rifle, straightening to her full height. 7 years, Victor. 7 years in cages. Running. Hiding. Her voice grew stronger with each word. "No more Owen." She began walking forward, hands empty at her sides. Coleman's men raised their weapons, but he motioned them to wait, curiosity evident on his face. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Showing my son the truth," Ruth replied. She stopped 10 feet from Coleman's horse, looking directly at Isaac. I never abandoned you. I thought you were dead. I mourned you every day. Isaac stared at her, doubt and hope mingling in his expression. He said you killed people, that you were a monster. I did kill, Ruth acknowledged, to protect you, to survive. Her eyes never left the boys. But I am not a monster. I'm your mother. Coleman's patience snapped. Enough. He raised the pistol, aiming it squarely at Ruth's chest. The journal, or I end this now. It's over, Victor, Ruth said calmly. Look around you. For the first time, Coleman seemed to notice the shifting dynamics. Several of his men had lowered their weapons, uncomfortable with threatening a woman speaking to her child. Others were watching the ridge where Julian Miller had been joined by more figures. Samuel Morgan and a group of riders bearing the unmistakable badges of federal marshals. What is this? Coleman demanded, voice rising. Justice, Ruth repeated. The real kind. Samuel rode forward, holding up the black journal. We found Sarah's records, Coleman. Delivered copies to the federal authorities this morning. Impossible, Coleman whispered, face draining of color. Your housekeeper helped, Samuel continued. Seems she'd been keeping her own records. Years of them. Coleman's control shattered. With a cry of rage, he aimed his pistol at Ruth and fired. Ruth lunged forward as the shot rang out, reaching for Isaac. Coleman's bullet grazed her shoulder, but she barely felt it as her hands closed around her son, pulling him from the horse. They tumbled to the ground together as chaos erupted around them. Tobias fired, his shot striking Coleman in the arm. The judge dropped his pistol, screaming in pain and fury. His men, seeing federal marshals approaching, began throwing down their weapons or fleeing. Ruth curled her body around Isaac, shielding him from the gunfire. The boy clung to her, face pressed against her neck. She could feel his tears, his trembling, the racing of his heart matching her own. I've got you, she whispered. I've got you now. As quickly as it had erupted, the gunfire ceased. Ruth looked up to see Coleman being dragged from his horse by Julian Miller, his fine coat stained with blood, his face contorted with hatred. You've ruined everything, he spat at Ruth. No, she replied, rising with Isaac held protectively at her side. You did that yourself. The federal marshals surrounded Coleman, one reading charges as another bound his wrists. Tobias approached Ruth cautiously, his eyes fixed on the boy beside her. You all right? He asked softly. Ruth nodded, her arm around Isaac's shoulders. We both are. She looked down at her son, who stared up at Tobias with wary curiosity. Isaac, this is Tobias. He's a friend. Tobias knelt to the boy's level. Pleased to meet you, Isaac. Your mother's told me about you. Isaac looked between them, confusion evident. Are you my father now? The question caught them both off guard. Ruth recovered first, her voice gentle. No, Isaac. Tobias is someone who helped me find you again. Someone who believed me when no one else did. The boy considered this solemnly, then extended his hand to Tobias in a gesture of adult formality that broke Ruth's heart a little. Thank you for helping my mother. Tobias shook the small hand gravely. It was my honor. As the marshals led Coleman away, Samuel approached, favoring his left leg but otherwise unharmed. Federal Marshal Davis wants statements from everyone, he reported. They've been building a case against Coleman for months. Our evidence was the final piece. Ruth nodded, keeping Isaac close. We'll tell them everything. What happens now? Tobias asked. Samuel glanced toward the setting sun. Justice? For Sarah Coleman, for all of Victor's victims. He smiled slightly. And for you, Ruth. Ruth looked around the ranch, at the damaged buildings, the overturned wagon, the evidence of violence. Then at Isaac, alive and real beside her. At Tobias, steady and certain. At Samuel and Julian, unlikely allies. Now, she said softly, we rebuild. The following days passed in a blur of statements, testimonies, and tearful reunions. The federal authorities established temporary headquarters in Silver Creek, gathering evidence against not only Coleman, but his network of corrupt officials and businessmen. Sarah Coleman's journal proved devastating, detailing years of criminal activity that stretched from Montana to Washington, D.C. Ruth told her story fully for the first time, every painful detail laid bare for the official record. Isaac remained by her side throughout, absorbing the truth of his past with a child's remarkable resilience. Each night, Ruth would sit by his bed in Tobias's house, answering his questions, filling in the gaps of his memories, sometimes just watching him sleep, the miracle she had never dared hope for. 1 week after Coleman's arrest, Marshal Davis visited the ranch. The distinguished older man carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen the worst of humanity, yet maintained his faith in justice. The case against Coleman is ironclad, he informed them as they sat around Tobias's kitchen table. Multiple counts of murder, corruption, intimidation. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. And his accomplices? Tobias asked. We've already arrested 3 judges and a state senator, Davis replied with satisfaction. The investigation continues. Ruth, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, finally spoke. What about me? I killed 3 men. Davis regarded her thoughtfully. Self-defense and defense of a child, according to our investigation. No charges will be filed. The simplicity of this statement, this absolution, left Ruth speechless. After years of running, of being hunted, the idea that she was truly free seemed impossible to grasp. There's something else, Davis continued, reaching into his coat. He produced an official-looking document and slid it across the table to Ruth. This arrived from Washington this morning. Ruth unfolded the paper, reading slowly. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. What is it? Tobias asked. A pardon, she whispered, and compensation for wrongful imprisonment. Davis nodded. The government acknowledges the injustice you suffered, Mrs. Mercer. It's not enough, of course. Nothing could be. But it's recognition, at least. Ruth carefully refolded the document. Thank you. After the marshal left, Ruth walked alone to the ridge overlooking the ranch. The land stretched before her, bathed in afternoon light. Tobias's land, which had become a sanctuary, then a battleground, and now something else, something that felt dangerously like home. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Tobias approaching, his expression thoughtful. Marshall's gone? She asked. He nodded. Headed back to town. Said they'll need you to testify when the trials begin. I'll be there. Tobias came to stand beside her, both of them looking out over the valley. What will you do now, Ruth? With the compensation money, you could go anywhere. Start fresh. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Ruth considered it carefully. Isaac needs stability, she said finally. He's had enough upheaval. That's not what I asked. Ruth turned to him, really looking at him. This man who had purchased her freedom, who had believed in her, who had fought beside her. The lines of his face had grown familiar, almost necessary. What would you have me do? She asked quietly. Tobias met her gaze steadily. Stay. Not because you need to, because you want to. As what, Tobias? Your wife in name? Your partner? Your burden? As yourself, he replied simply. As Ruth. The rest, we can figure out as we go. Before she could respond, a shout from the house caught their attention. Isaac was running toward them, waving excitedly. Ma, Tobias, Samuel's back, and he brought someone. They turned to see Samuel's wagon approaching, a woman seated beside him, Clara Morris, with Miriam bouncing eagerly on the seat. They made it, Ruth breathed in relief. As they walked back to the house together, Isaac slipped his hand into Ruth's, the gesture so natural it made her heart ache. With her other hand, she reached hesitantly for Tobias. After a moment's surprise, his fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. The future stretched before them, unwritten but full of possibilities. For the first time in 7 years, Ruth allowed herself to hope. 3 days later, Ruth stood in the small cemetery on the hill behind Tobias's ranch. The morning was crisp, autumn giving way to winter's first breath. Beside her, Isaac watched solemnly as Samuel drove the last nail into the simple wooden cross. The grave was symbolic. They had no body to bury, but Ruth had insisted on marking Mary Tanner's sacrifice properly. The woman who had saved Isaac, who had raised him as her own, deserved to be remembered. What was she like? Isaac asked quietly as Samuel stepped back from his work. Ruth considered her answer carefully. Brave, kind, loyal to those she loved. She placed her hand on Isaac's shoulder. She was your mother too, Isaac, in all the ways that matter. The boy nodded, placing the small bunch of wildflowers he'd collected at the base of the cross. I miss her sometimes. That's as it should be, Ruth assured him. We'll always remember her. They stood in silence for a moment longer, then turned back toward the house. Tobias waited on the porch, deep in conversation with Julian Miller, who had returned from escorting Coleman to the territorial prison. As they approached, Ruth caught fragments of their discussion, something about land, opportunities, the future. Julian nodded to her respectfully as she reached the steps. Mrs. Mercer, he greeted her. Just Ruth, she corrected him. What brings you back this way? Julian exchanged glances with Tobias. I've been considering a change of profession. Bounty hunting loses its appeal when you realize how many innocent people get caught in the system. What will you do instead? She asked. That's what we were discussing, Tobias explained. The valley beyond the North Ridge, it's good land, unclaimed. With Coleman gone, there'll be families looking for fresh starts, people who were under his thumb. Ruth understood immediately. You're thinking of establishing a settlement. Julian nodded. Marshall Davis suggested it. A place for people who need second chances. His eyes met hers briefly. People like us. The idea took root in Ruth's mind, growing with unexpected speed. A community built on redemption rather than judgment. A place where Isaac could grow up surrounded by people who understood that the past shaped but did not define you. It would take work, she said thoughtfully. Resources. The compensation money, Tobias suggested. If you wanted, Ruth looked at him sharply. That's for Isaac's future. This could be his future, Tobias countered gently. Our future. All of us. The word our lingered between them, filled with meaning. Ruth turned to watch Isaac, now playing with Miriam in the yard, their laughter carrying on the clear air. I'll think about it, she said finally. That night, after Isaac had fallen asleep, Ruth found Tobias on the porch, pipe in hand, staring at the stars. She sat beside him, the wooden rocking chair creaking softly beneath her weight. I've been thinking, she began. Dangerous, he commented with the ghost of a smile. Ruth allowed herself a small smile in return. About the valley, the settlement. Tobias waited, his patience one of the qualities she had come to value most. If we do this, she continued carefully, it needs to be a true haven, not just for us, for anyone who needs one. Agreed. And Isaac needs to be protected. His name, his history. Of course, Ruth fell silent, organizing her thoughts. I've spent so long running, Tobias, being hunted, being afraid. She looked at him directly. I'm not sure I remember how to live any other way. Tobias considered this. When I came back from the war, he said finally, I couldn't sleep under a roof, too confining, too quiet. I spent months in the barn before I could stand being in the house again. He tapped his pipe against the porch rail. Some scars don't heal clean. They just become part of you. Is that supposed to be comforting? Ruth asked, though there was no bite in her words. It's supposed to be true, he replied simply. You don't have to know all the answers tonight, Ruth, or tomorrow, or next year. His eyes held hers. Just know you're not alone in figuring them out. The promise in those words, not of romance or even happiness, but of steadfast presence, touched something deep within her. Ruth reached across the space between them, her hand finding his in the darkness. Then I suppose, she said softly, we should start planning a settlement. The next morning, Ruth woke before dawn, a habit from years of vigilance. She moved quietly through the house, checking on Isaac, still soundly asleep, one arm flung above his head, just as he had slept as a toddler. She stepped outside into the crisp pre-dawn air, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, stars fading as the first hint of color touched the horizon. A sound from the barn caught her attention, the rhythmic strike of hammer on metal. Curious, she made her way across the yard. Inside, Samuel worked at a makeshift forge, the orange glow illuminating his concentrated face. Beside him stood Julian, holding something steady on the anvil. Early start? She asked, announcing her presence. Both men looked up, not entirely surprised to see her. Couldn't sleep, Samuel admitted. Thought I'd make myself useful. Ruth approached, examining their work. Samuel was crafting a sign, the letters taking shape under his skilled hands. Haven. For the settlement, Julian explained. Every new beginning needs a name. Haven. The word resonated within Ruth, perfect in its simplicity. A place of safety, of refuge. Everything she had sought for herself and Isaac all these years. It's good, she said softly. As the sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Ruth stood in the doorway of the barn, watching these men, strangers months ago, now something closer to family, forge the first tangible symbol of their shared future. Beyond the barn, Tobias emerged from the house, pausing when he spotted her. Their eyes met across the distance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. This was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, Coleman's allies to face, a community to build, personal demons to conquer. But for the first time, Ruth faced the future not with dread, but with determination. She was no longer the woman in the cage. She was Ruth Mercer, mother of Isaac, builder of Haven. Free. Winter settled over the valley like a heavy blanket, transforming Tobias's ranch into a world of pristine white and crystalline silence. The first snowfall came early, blanketing the land before Thanksgiving and bringing with it a strange sense of peace. For Ruth, who had spent previous winters either imprisoned or on the run, the snow offered an unexpected reprieve. No one would be traveling these roads until spring thaw, giving them time to heal, to plan, to become something more than survivors. The ranch house, once spacious for a solitary man, now bustled with life. Samuel had constructed additional rooms off the main structure, rough but sturdy, providing space for himself and Julian. The Morris family had moved into the old foreman's cabin near the creek, renovated with Franklin's carpentry skills. With 7 adults and 2 children now sharing the property, privacy was scarce but companionship plentiful. On this particular morning, Ruth stood at the kitchen window, coffee warming her hands as she watched Isaac and Miriam build a snow fortress, their laughter visible in puffs of condensed breath. At 10, Isaac was still painfully thin, the legacy of years of neglect under Coleman's occasional supervision. But his cheeks had begun to fill out, his eyes to sparkle with genuine joy rather than wary vigilance. He's thriving, Claire observed, joining Ruth at the window. In the months since their escape from the robbers, Clara had transformed from a fragile victim into a woman of quiet strength, her friendship becoming one of Ruth's unexpected treasures. He is, Ruth agreed, though concern shadowed her voice. But he still wakes screaming some nights. Afraid Coleman will return. Clara nodded in understanding. Miriam, too. Trauma leaves deep tracks, especially in children. She touched Ruth's arm gently. But they're resilient, and they have us now. The sound of boots stomping snow from the porch announced Tobias's return from the barn. He entered with a gust of cold air, his beard frosted, cheeks ruddy from exertion. Mail came through, he announced, producing several envelopes from his coat. Ryder from Silver Creek managed to get through before the North Pass closes completely. Ruth accepted the letter he extended to her, recognizing Marshall Davis's handwriting. She opened it with fingers still stiff from cold, scanning the contents quickly. Coleman's trial has been set for April, she reported. They want me in Fort Benton to testify. Tobias hung his coat by the fire. Will you go? I have to, Ruth replied simply, to finish this. He nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. Over the past months, they had developed a language of their own, brief words carrying volumes of meaning, silences that communicated more clearly than speeches. Ruth found comfort in this economy of expression, so different from Coleman's verbose manipulations or the jeering crowds at her cage. There's more, she continued, reading further. They've uncovered additional evidence against Coleman's network. 3 more arrests, including Judge Harmon from Idaho Territory. Good, Tobias said with grim satisfaction. Let them all fall. Claire excused herself to check on the children, leaving Ruth and Tobias alone in the kitchen. He moved to pour himself coffee, his shoulder brushing hers in the small space, a casual intimacy that would have been unthinkable months ago, but now felt natural, almost necessary. How are the plans for Haven coming? Ruth asked, changing the subject to something more hopeful. Tobias's expression lightened. Samuel finished the survey yesterday. The valley has good water, sheltered positions for at least 12 homesteads. Julian's already drawn up basic plots. He hesitated. Marshal Davis sent word that 3 families are interested. People who testified against Coleman, who can't stay in their communities. When would they come? Spring if the pass is clear early, May otherwise. Ruth considered this, the reality of their vision taking shape faster than anticipated. We need to be ready. Shelters built, fields cleared. We will be, Tobias assured her. She studied his face, the certainty in his weathered features. You've done this before. Built something from nothing. This ranch, he confirmed. After Elizabeth and Anna died, when I had nothing but grief and empty hands. His eyes met hers. Work saved me then. Purpose, Ruth understood completely. And now? Now it's not just about survival. His voice softened. It's about creating something worth surviving for. The depth of feeling in his words stirred something in Ruth, a warmth that had been growing slowly, cautiously, like the first green shoots after a forest fire. Before she could respond, the door burst open again, admitting Julian with an armful of firewood. Storm's picking up, he reported, depositing the logs by the hearth. Franklin says the creek's freezing solid. Might lose water access to the lower fields. Tobias nodded. We'll run lines from the spring instead. He glanced at Ruth. Ready to look at those building plans? She nodded, grateful for the return to practical matters. Emotions, especially these fragile, unfamiliar ones, remain treacherous territory. Far safer to discuss foundations and water supplies than the tentative bonds forming between them. Later that afternoon, the adults gathered around the large table in the main room, maps and drawings spread before them. Samuel had sketched a rough layout for Haven, a semicircle of homesteads facing a central common area, backed by forested hills for protection and lumber. Water access for every property, Julian pointed out, tracing the proposed irrigation channels, and clear sight lines to the main approach road. Defensive considerations? Ruth asked, noting the strategic positioning. Julian nodded. Coleman may be finished, but his allies aren't. And there are always those who prey on isolated settlements. We'll need a community building, Clara suggested, for gatherings, schooling, and rules, Franklin added. Every community needs them. Tobias looked thoughtful. Not rules so much as principles. This can't be like the towns we've left, built on power and fear. Haven needs to stand for something different. Equality, Ruth said immediately, no matter who you were before, what you did, what was done to you. Everyone stands equal here. Protection, Julian added, not just physical safety, but defending each other's right to peace, to dignity. Truth, Samuel contributed quietly, no more lies or secrets. They only give power to those who would use them against us. As they continued to plan, Ruth felt a strange sensation spreading through her chest. Not the hypervigilance that had kept her alive for years, but something warmer, more sustaining. Hope, perhaps, or belonging. Whatever it was, she allowed herself to lean into it, just a little. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them in their temporary sanctuary, giving them time to build not just a settlement, but a vision worth fighting for. January brought bitter cold that tested even Ruth's hardened resilience. The temperature dropped so severely that the air itself seemed to crystallize, trees cracking like gunshots in the frozen silence of night. They rationed firewood, slept in the main room near the hearth, and took turns checking the livestock through the long, dark hours. It was during one such night watch that Ruth found Tobias in the barn, methodically counting feed supplies by lantern light. He looked up at her entrance, unsurprised. They had developed an uncanny awareness of each other's movements. Couldn't sleep? He asked. Ruth shook her head, pulling her woolen coat tighter. Isaac had another nightmare. Coleman again. Concern crossed Tobias's face. Is he all right now? Clara's with him. She has a gift for soothing. Ruth moved closer to the lantern's warmth. He asked again today, about his father. Tobias set down his ledger. What did you tell him? The truth. That Caleb Vance was a cruel man who hurt us both. She stared into the lantern flame. But children need more than warnings. They need to understand. And you think he doesn't? Ruth struggled to articulate the concern that had been growing within her. I think he sees the world in simpler terms than we do. Good people and monsters. Her voice lowered. He needs to know that people are complicated, that even monsters were children once. Tobias considered this. You're worried he'll grow up fearing men, fearing himself. Yes, she admitted. How does a boy become a good man when his examples have been Coleman and Caleb Vance? He has others now, Tobias pointed out gently. Samuel, Julian, Franklin. And you, Ruth added, meeting his eyes directly. Something shifted in Tobias's expression, a softening, a question. Is that what you want? For me to be that for him? The air between them seemed to still, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Ruth had kept careful distance between them for months, the marriage that had freed her from the cage remaining unconsummated, undefined. Tobias had never pressed, never demanded, allowing her the space to heal at her own pace. But healing, Ruth was discovering, wasn't just about mending what was broken. It was about growing something new in the scarred places. I want, she began carefully, what's best for Isaac? But also, she took a steadying breath. I want to stop being afraid of wanting things for myself. Tobias set the lantern aside and stepped closer, moving with the deliberate gentleness he always showed around her. Not from fear of her strength, but from respect for her boundaries. And what do you want, Ruth? He asked, his voice low. To know if this, she gestured between them, is real or just convenient, born of circumstance rather than choice. Tobias considered her words with the seriousness they deserved. When I saw you in that cage, he said finally, I recognized something in you. Not just suffering, but endurance. Dignity no one could take. His weathered face softened with memory. I didn't plan what came after. I just knew I couldn't leave you there. And now, Ruth pressed, now I know you, your strength, your fierce protectiveness, how you check the perimeter before you sleep, how you cut your food into equal portions, how you watch the sky for weather like it might speak to you. His lips curved slightly. How you hide your smiles but can't conceal the light in your eyes when Isaac learns something new. The simple accuracy of his observations, the evidence that he had truly seen her, left Ruth momentarily speechless. I don't know what to call what's between us, Tobias continued, but it's not convenience, Ruth, it's choice. Every day. He extended his hand, palm up, an offering, not a demand. After a moment's hesitation, Ruth placed her hand in his, the calluses of their palms meeting like old friends. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, how to be with someone who doesn't want to possess or control. Neither do I, Tobias confessed. We'll learn together. Slowly. That word, together, hung in the cold barn air, fragile but full of promise. Ruth tightened her grip on his hand, a gesture of commitment more binding than any wedding vow. A sudden commotion outside broke the moment, voices calling urgently, boots crunching on snow. They moved as one toward the barn door, tension immediately replacing tenderness. Samuel met them halfway to the house, rifle in hand, face grim in the moonlight. Riders, he reported tersely. 3, maybe 4, approaching from the east ridge. Coleman's men? Ruth asked, already calculating defense positions. Don't think so, moving too openly. Julian emerged from the shadows of the porch, field glasses in hand. They're carrying something, a stretcher looks like. Tobias frowned. Injured travelers in this weather? Dangerous. Or desperate, Ruth added. They gathered their weapons, a precaution born of hard experience, and moved to the edge of the property. Franklin joined them, leaving Clara with the children in the storm cellar beneath the house. The approaching riders moved slowly through the deep snow, their breath and that of their horses clouding around them. As they drew closer, Ruth could make out a makeshift travois being pulled between two of the mounts, a still form bundled heavily upon it. Hold there, Tobias called when they were within earshot. State your business. The lead rider reined in, raising gloved hands to show they held no weapons. We need help, a woman's voice called back, her accent distinctly southern. My husband's hurt bad. No doctor for 30 miles. Ruth exchanged glances with Tobias. It could be a trick. They'd all seen such tactics before, but the desperation in the woman's voice rang true. Approach slowly, Tobias directed. Just you, ma'am. The woman urged her horse forward, emerging from the shadows into the moonlight. She was perhaps 50, her face weathered by sun and hardship, gray-streaked hair escaping from beneath a battered hat. Her eyes moved rapidly between their raised weapons, settling finally on Ruth. You the healer? She asked directly. They said in Silver Creek there was a tall woman living out this way who knew medicine. Ruth stepped forward. I have some knowledge. What happened to your husband? Logging accident, tree fell wrong, crushed his leg 3 days ago. The woman's composure cracked slightly. Infection set in. He's burning with fever. Ruth made her decision. Bring him to the barn. It's warmer there. She turned to Samuel. I'll need hot water, clean cloths, my herb box from under the bed. Within minutes, they had transformed the barn into a makeshift infirmary. The injured man, Thomas Wheeler, his wife Margaret explained, lay semi-conscious on a bed of clean straw, his left leg swollen grotesquely beneath blood-soaked bandages. Ruth cut away the filthy wrappings, her expression grim as the full extent of the injury was revealed. The leg was badly broken, the bone having pierced the skin, and angry red streaks of infection spread upward toward his thigh. How long has he been feverish? She asked, checking his pulse. 2 days, Margaret replied, clutching her husband's limp hand. Started raving last night. That's when we decided to risk moving him. Ruth nodded, her mind already cataloging necessary steps. The infection is severe. I need to clean the wound, set the bone, and draw out the poison. She looked up at Margaret directly. I won't lie to you. He might still lose a leg. Or worse. Do what you can, the older woman said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He's a fighter. Through the long night, Ruth worked tirelessly, drawing on knowledge gained during her years as a midwife and her own experiences with injury. Tobias assisted, his steady hands following her instructions without question. Julian kept the fire burning hot, while Samuel rode to the creek to break through the ice for fresh water. Even Franklin contributed, fashioning a splint from seasoned wood. By dawn, Thomas Wheeler's fever had broken. The angry red streaks receded from his thigh. He slept now, his breathing even, his wife dozing beside him on a makeshift pallet. Ruth emerged from the barn into the pristine morning light, exhaustion etched in every line of her body. Tobias waited on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, which she accepted gratefully. He'll live, she reported, sinking onto the bench beside him. Keep the leg too, most likely, though he'll have a permanent limp. You did well, Tobias observed, pride evident in his voice. Ruth shook her head. I just remembered what I was taught, long ago. Knowledge is one thing, skill is another. He studied her face in the early light. You were a healer before. You could be again. The idea settled within Ruth like a seed finding fertile ground. Before Coleman, before the cage, she had helped bring life into the world, had eased suffering, had used her hands to heal rather than harm. Perhaps, she allowed, too tired for deeper reflection. As the sun climbed higher, Margaret Wheeler emerged from the barn, moving stiffly from her night on the hard floor. She approached Ruth with determined steps. My Thomas is asking for you, she said. Wants to thank you proper. Ruth nodded, rising despite her exhaustion. Inside the barn, Thomas Wheeler lay propped against a hay bale, his color much improved, eyes clear with returning health. Mrs. Granger, he greeted her, voice weak but steady. My wife says you saved my life. And my leg. Ruth accepted his thanks with a simple nod. You need rest, and the wound must be kept clean. We'll stay until he can travel, Margaret added. If that's all right, our son and daughter-in-law are expecting us in Helena, but they'll understand the delay. You're welcome here, Ruth assured her, turning to leave. Wait, Thomas called. There's something else. His expression grew troubled. While I was fevered, I heard things. Talk of a settlement you're planning, a place called Haven. Ruth tensed slightly. What of it? Is it true that anyone can come? Start fresh? The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. Ruth studied the man before her. A stranger, neither ally nor enemy, just someone seeking shelter from life's storms. That's the intention, she answered carefully. Why do you ask? Thomas exchanged glances with his wife. We've been looking for somewhere to settle. Somewhere, different. He hesitated. I fought for the Confederacy. After the war, there weren't many places that welcomed us back north. But we can't go south again either. Ruth absorbed this, understanding the complicated history implied in his words. Haven isn't about where you came from, she said finally. It's about where you're going, what you're willing to build together. Relief washed over Thomas's weathered face. Then we'd like to be considered. We don't have much, but I'm a skilled carpenter when I'm not being foolish around falling trees. He managed a weak smile. And Margaret here can grow anything in any soil. Ask her about her tomatoes. The unexpected request caught Ruth off guard. Haven had been a vision, a possibility, something for the future. Now suddenly it was becoming real, with actual people wanting to join, to contribute. We'll discuss it, she promised, not committing further. Rest now. Outside, she found Tobias splitting wood, his rhythmic movements speaking of years of practice. He paused when he saw her expression. "What is it?" he asked. Ruth relayed the Wheeler's request, watching his reaction carefully. "They're strangers," she concluded. "We know nothing about them beyond what they've told us." Tobias rested his axe against the chopping block. "Isn't that the point of Haven? A place where the past matters less than the present? Where what you do matters more than what you've done?" "In theory," Ruth acknowledged, "but in practice, we were all strangers once," he reminded her gently. Ruth couldn't argue with that simple truth. She had been the ultimate stranger, dangerous, mysterious, brought to his home in chains. Yet he had seen beyond that to the person beneath. "We'll need to be careful," she said finally. "Establish clear expectations, boundaries." Tobias nodded, understanding her caution. "Of course, but Ruth..." He waited until she met his eyes. "This is how it begins, not with grand plans, but with one family in need, then another, then more." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of childish laughter floated from the house. Isaac and Miriam, emerging to investigate the newcomers. Ruth watched as they approached Margaret Wheeler, curiosity overcoming shyness. "Mrs. Wheeler," Miriam called, "is it true you can grow tomatoes big as apples?" The older woman's face transformed with delight. "Bigger, child, much bigger." And just like that, connections formed. New threads in the tapestry they were weaving together. February brought a brief thaw, enough to allow Samuel and Julian to begin clearing the first plots in the valley. With Thomas Wheeler's recovery progressing well, he joined their planning sessions, contributing valuable insights on construction techniques suited to the harsh Montana winters. The mail rider made it through again, bringing more letters from Marshall Davis, updates on Coleman's case, details about the upcoming trial, and news that had Ruth pacing the floor long after the others had gone to bed. "What is it?" Tobias asked, finding her still awake near midnight, staring into the dying fire. Ruth handed him the letter she'd been reading and rereading. They found Sarah Coleman. Tobias scanned the page quickly, his expression shifting from surprise to grim satisfaction. "Alive in an asylum in Denver." "All these years," Ruth whispered, "he didn't kill her. He imprisoned her." "A fate perhaps worse than death," Tobias observed darkly. Ruth nodded, remembering the delicate, intelligent woman who had been her ally in Coleman's household. "Davis says she's willing to testify, that she's been documenting everything since she was committed." "Good. The more evidence against Coleman, the better." "There's more." Ruth pointed to the bottom of the page. "She's asking to see me, before the trial." Tobias looked up sharply. "In Denver? That's at least 2 weeks' journey in this weather." "I know." Ruth resumed her pacing. "But I owe her this, Tobias. She tried to warn me about Coleman, risked herself to help me escape." "Then we'll go," he said simply. Ruth stopped, turning to face him. "We? You didn't think I'd let you make that journey alone, did you?" His tone made it clear the matter wasn't open for debate. "Isaac, we'll be fine with Clara and Franklin. Samuel and Julian, too." He stepped closer. "Ruth, you don't have to face this alone. Not anymore." The sincerity in his words penetrated the protective shell she still maintained around her heart. "Thank you," she said softly. Tobias nodded, understanding all she couldn't yet express. "We'll leave after the next storm passes. Should be a clear window before March brings the heavy snows." As he turned to go, Ruth called after him. "Tobias," he paused, looking back. "Last night into the barn, what we started to discuss." A small smile touched his lips. "It'll keep, Ruth. We have time." But as she watched him go, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that time was not the limitless resource it appeared. Coleman's trial approached. Haven would soon welcome its first residents. Isaac grew more independent daily. The world was shifting beneath their feet, transforming from the simple survival they understood into something more complex, a future with possibilities beyond mere endurance. And somewhere in that future, Ruth was beginning to see a place for herself not defined by cages or by running, but by choice, by connection, by love, perhaps, if she dared name the tender feeling taking root within her. The journey to Denver was arduous, even with the brief February thaw. Ruth and Tobias traveled by stage where possible, on horseback where necessary, staying in rough wayside inns, or camping when no shelter could be found. They spoke little, conserving energy for the miles ahead, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with growing understanding. Denver appeared suddenly through a mountain pass, its buildings sprawling across the valley floor like scattered blocks. Ruth tensed as they approached, the press of humanity after months of relative isolation setting her nerves on edge. "You all right?" Tobias asked, noting her rigid posture. "Cities," she replied simply. "Too many people, too many eyes." He nodded in understanding. "We won't stay long, just enough to see Sarah, rest the horses, and start back." The Colorado State Asylum stood on a hill overlooking the city, its imposing brick facade and barred windows reminiscent of a prison. Ruth stared up at it, fighting the instinctive urge to flee. "Another kind of cage," she murmured. Tobias placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Remember why we're here." Inside, they were met by a severe-looking physician who examined their authorization from Marshall Davis with obvious skepticism. "Mrs. Coleman is a disturbed woman," he warned, leading them down a sterile corridor, "prone to delusions, particularly regarding her husband." "Delusions?" Ruth repeated, voice dangerously calm. "Claims of attempted murder? Conspiracy." The doctor shook his head. "Paranoid fantasies, all documented in Judge Coleman's commitment papers. The poor man has paid handsomely for her care all these years." Ruth exchanged glances with Tobias, reading the controlled anger in his eyes that matched her own. "How convenient," she remarked coldly, "that anyone who speaks against powerful men can be labeled mad." The doctor bristled. "I assure you, madam, our diagnoses are based on medical science, not—" "Take us to her," Tobias interrupted firmly. They were led to a small, private room, better appointed than Ruth had expected, with a window overlooking the gardens, books lining the shelves, and a writing desk covered with papers. Seated by the window was a slender woman with prematurely silver hair, her posture perfect despite years of confinement. "Mrs. Coleman," the doctor announced, "your visitors from Montana." Sarah Coleman turned, her pale blue eyes immediately finding Ruth's. For a moment, neither woman spoke, measuring the changes 7 years had wrought. Then Sarah rose, crossing the room with graceful steps to stand before Ruth. "You survived," she said simply, her voice cultured, but stronger than Ruth remembered. "As did you," Ruth replied. Sarah's lips curved in a smile that held no humor. "Barely." She glanced at the doctor, hovering near the door. "Leave us, Dr. Mills. These are federal witnesses. You have no authority to monitor our conversation." The doctor sputtered indignantly, but withdrew when Tobias moved pointedly to stand between him and the women. Once alone, Sarah gestured to the chairs by the window. "Please sit. We have much to discuss, and I'm told our time is limited." As they settled, Ruth studied the woman before her more carefully. Sarah Coleman had been beautiful once, in a delicate porcelain way that had contrasted sharply with Ruth's imposing stature. Now her face was lined, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes remained keen, intelligent. "Marshall Davis tells me Victor will finally face justice," Sarah began. Ruth nodded. "The trial begins in April. They've uncovered much of his network." "Good, though I imagine there are still those who protect him." "Fewer each day," Tobias contributed. "Your journal was instrumental in that." Sarah turned her attention to him, assessing. "You must be Tobias Granger. Davis mentioned you in his letters." Her gaze returned to Ruth. "He said you found unexpected freedom." The loaded phrasing wasn't lost on Ruth. "Many kinds," she acknowledged, "including my son, alive after all." Sarah's composed facade cracked slightly. "Isaac lives? Oh, Ruth." She pressed a hand to her mouth. "That's wonderful news. Truly." "You knew him," Ruth realized. "Before." "I helped Mary hide him," Sarah confirmed, "after they brought you back to the estate. Victor thought She hesitated. He thought the boy was leverage to make you reveal where you'd hidden my journal. When you maintained you knew nothing, he assumed you were protecting Isaac. I thought he was dead, Ruth said softly. I mourned him for 7 years. Sarah reached across the small space between them, her fingers cool against Ruth's hand. I'm so sorry. If I'd known you survived, I would have found a way to tell you. Ruth accepted the touch, the apology. You risked everything to help me. You have nothing to be sorry for. Sarah withdrew her hand, composure returning. Not everything was altruism. I wanted Victor destroyed as much as you did. Her expression hardened. He killed our child, you know, before you came, when I threatened to leave him, to expose his crimes. The revelation hung heavy in the air between them. The poison wasn't for you, Ruth realized. It was for the baby. Sarah nodded, grief briefly shadowing her face. After that, I began keeping records. Detailed notes on everything. His business dealings, his political manipulation, the network of men who protected each other. She gestured to the papers on her desk. I never stopped, even here. Especially here. That's why we came, Tobias said. Marshal Davis believes your testimony, combined with the evidence already gathered, will ensure Coleman never sees freedom again. Oh, I'll testify, Sarah assured them, steel entering her voice. I've waited 7 years for this moment, prepared for it, endured for it. Ruth recognized the expression on the other woman's face, the focused determination of someone who had survived by channeling suffering into purpose. It was like looking into a mirror. There's something else, Sarah continued, rising to retrieve a small, leather-bound book from her desk. This is for you, Ruth. I've kept it all these years, hoping someday to return it. Ruth accepted the book with questioning eyes. Open it, Sarah urged. Inside, Ruth found page after page of careful sketches, a child's growth documented in charcoal and pencil. Isaac at 6, 7, 8, all the years she had missed, captured by Sarah's skilled hand. How? Oh, Ruth whispered, throat tight with emotion. Mary would bring him to visit me when she could, Sarah explained. She knew I was alone, that I'd lost my own child, and she wanted Isaac to know his story, even if in pieces. She smiled sadly. He would ask about you, what you looked like, what songs you sang. I drew these to help him remember. Ruth traced a small face with gentle fingers, seeing hints of herself in the set of the jaw, the determined eyes. Thank you, she managed, the words entirely inadequate for the gift she'd been given. There's one more thing, Sarah said, her voice lowering. Something Marshal Davis doesn't know yet. Something I've only recently pieced together from my records and what I've overheard from the doctors. Tobias leaned forward, alert to the change in her tone. What is it? Victor wasn't working alone, Sarah began, glancing toward the door to ensure they remained unobserved. His network extends beyond Montana, beyond judges and local officials. There are powerful people in Washington who have protected him for years. Politicians, Ruth guessed. Yes, but also industrialists, men who've been buying up land across the territories, using proxies like Victor to force sales, manipulate records. Sarah's expression grew grim. Your ranch, Mr. Granger, sits on land they want very badly, as does the valley where I understand you're establishing your settlement. Tobias frowned. For the railroad? Partially, but also for what lies beneath. Sarah leaned closer. There's coal there, possibly silver too. They've known for years, kept it quiet while they acquired surrounding properties. The implications settled over Ruth like a physical weight. Coleman's attack on the ranch wasn't just about you or the journal, Sarah confirmed. It was about the land itself. These men, Tobias pressed, do you have names? Sarah nodded, sliding a folded paper across the table. 3 senators, a railroad magnate, the head of a mining consortium, all mentioned in my journals, but these connections I've only recently verified. Tobias pocketed the paper without looking at it. This changes things. Indeed, Sarah agreed. You're not just fighting one corrupt judge, but a system designed to protect wealth and power at all costs. Her eyes held Ruth steadily. They won't stop just because Victor is imprisoned. In fact, they may accelerate their plans, fearing what else might be exposed. Ruth absorbed this new threat, measuring it against all they had already overcome. "Then we'll be ready," she said simply. Sarah studied her with something like admiration. "You've changed, Ruth. There's a steadiness to you now, a certainty." "I'm not alone anymore," Ruth replied, glancing at Tobias. "None of us are." As their visit concluded, Sarah embraced Ruth at the door, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in their previous lives, separated as they were by class and circumstance. "When this is over," Ruth promised, "there's a place for you at Haven, if you want it." Sarah's eyes brightened with unexpected tears. "I'd like that very much." Outside the asylum, Ruth paused on the steps, breathing deeply of the crisp mountain air. The book of drawings was secure inside her coat, a treasure beyond price. "You all right?" Tobias asked, his steady presence beside her a comfort she was only now learning to acknowledge. Ruth considered the question honestly. "No," she admitted, "but I will be." As they descended toward the waiting horses, Ruth felt a strange lightening, as if in connecting with Sarah, in receiving this unexpected record of her son's lost years, some long-carried burden had shifted. Not disappeared, but perhaps become more bearable. "We should start back tomorrow," Tobias suggested as they mounted. "Weather could turn any day." Ruth nodded agreement, but her mind was already racing ahead, to Isaac waiting at the ranch, to the valley where Haven would rise, to the new threat Sarah had revealed. "They'll come for the land," she said as they rode through Denver's bustling streets. "These powerful men. They won't stop just because Coleman falls." "No," Tobias agreed grimly. "They won't. Haven will need more than principles then. It will need defenses, protection." Tobias studied her profile, reading the determination in her posture. "We'll build them. Together." That word again, together, simple but profound in its implications. Ruth felt its resonance deep within her, a foundation being laid stone by stone. As they left Denver behind, riding north toward home, Ruth found herself thinking not of cages or of running, but of building, of creating something strong enough to withstand whatever storms approached. Not just walls and roofs, but community, family, love. The wooden horse Isaac had carved rested in her saddlebag, a talisman connecting past to present. The book of drawings nestled against her heart. And beside her rode a man who had seen her value when she herself had forgotten it existed. For the first time in 7 years, Ruth allowed herself to look forward rather than back, to plan not just for survival, but for life. The snow began to fall as they crossed into Wyoming territory, gentle flakes that melted on contact with skin. Ruth turned her face upward, feeling each cool touch like a blessing, a promise. Whatever came next, she would face it not from within a cage, but standing free beneath an open sky. The spring thaw came early to Montana territory, the warming days of March coaxing life from the frozen ground. At Tobias's ranch, now increasingly referred to as the homestead rather than Granger's place, preparations for the journey to Fort Benton intensified as Coleman's trial date approached. Ruth stood on the porch in the crisp morning air, watching Isaac and Miriam help Samuel load supplies onto the wagons. Her son had grown taller over the winter, his frame filling out with healthy food and steady work. More importantly, the wariness that had shadowed his eyes for so long had begun to fade, replaced by the natural curiosity and exuberance of childhood. "He'll be fine while we're gone," Clara assured her, joining Ruth on the porch. "Franklin and I will keep him busy with planting. He won't have time to worry." Ruth nodded, grateful for the reassurance. "It's not just Coleman's trial that concerns me," she admitted. "It's what Sarah told us, about the men behind him, the ones who want our land." Clara's expression grew serious. "Samuel mentioned something about that. Coal deposits? And possibly silver." Ruth gestured toward the northern ridge, where the valley that would become Haven lay waiting. "Prime railroad access too, once the line is extended." "What will you do?" Ruth considered the question carefully. "Prepare. Build our community stronger than they expect. Find allies." Clara smiled slightly. "You've changed, Ruth. When you first came here, you'd have planned to face this threat alone." "I'm learning," Ruth acknowledged. Slowly. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Tobias rode in from the east field, his expression somber as he dismounted. "Mail came through," he reported, joining them on the porch. "Davis sent word. The trial's been moved up to next week. Ruth tensed. Week by. Doesn't say specifically, just urges us to leave immediately. He handed her the telegram. Says Sarah Coleman has already been transported to Fort Benton under guard. The implications were clear. Powerful forces were accelerating events, perhaps hoping to catch them unprepared. How soon can we leave? Ruth asked. Tomorrow at dawn, Tobias replied. Julian's arranged an escort as far as Helena. Samuel will remain here with Franklin and Clara, keep working on the haven preparations. Ruth nodded, her mind already sorting through necessary arrangements. I need to speak with Isaac. She found her son by the barn, helping William Wheeler, Thomas's older son who had arrived 2 weeks prior, repair a wagon wheel. At 10, Isaac took such responsibilities seriously, his small hands surprisingly skilled with tools. Isaac, she called, can we talk? He looked up, wiping his hands on his trousers before joining her. They walked together to the old oak that stood sentinel at the edge of the property, their special place for important conversations. You're leaving tomorrow, Isaac said before she could begin, for the trial. Ruth wasn't surprised by his awareness. Little escaped his notice these days. Yes, sooner than we expected. Because of the bad judge. Not a question. Yes, Coleman must answer for what he's done. Isaac scuffed at the dirt with his boot. Will I have to go too? See him again? No, Ruth assured him firmly. You'll stay here with Claire and Franklin. Safe. Relief washed over his young face, quickly replaced by concern. But you'll have to see him. I will. She knelt to his level, meeting his eyes directly. It's necessary, Isaac, to finish this, to make sure he can never hurt anyone again. Are you scared? He asked with a child's directness. Ruth considered lying, offering false bravado to ease his worry, but she had promised him truth, always. Yes, she admitted, not of Coleman himself, but of what he represents, the power he once had over our lives. Isaac absorbed this, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. Ma says the only way past fear is through it. Ruth smiled slightly, recognizing Clara's wisdom in the words. She's right. How long will you be gone? 2 weeks, maybe 3. She touched his cheek gently. I'll come back, Isaac. I promise. He nodded solemnly. I know. Then with sudden urgency, he reached into his pocket, producing a small carved figure, a horse, similar to the one she had made him as a baby, but with his own childish craftsmanship evident in every line. I made this, for luck. Ruth accepted the gift, emotion tightening her throat. It's beautiful. Tobias helped, Isaac admitted, but I did most of it. I'll keep it with me, she promised, every step of the journey. That night, after the household had settled into sleep, Ruth found herself restless, checking and rechecking preparations for the journey. She was in the barn, examining the wagon one final time, when Tobias found her. You should be resting, he observed, though without reproach. So should you, she countered. He acknowledged this with a small smile, moving to stand beside her in the lantern light. Isaac showed me his carving. He worked on it for weeks. He's getting skillful, Ruth said, pride evident in her voice. Like his father was before, she trailed off, the comparison to Caleb Vance uncomfortable even after all this time. You never talk about him, Tobias noted. Caleb, Ruth stiffened slightly. What's to say? He was cruel. He died. He was more than that to you once, Tobias said gently. You chose him, or at least accepted him, before you knew what he truly was. The observation struck unexpectedly close. Ruth turned away, busying herself with adjusting the wagon cover. I was 17, desperate to escape my father's house. Caleb seemed, she searched for the right word, solid, dependable. Until he wasn't. Until he wasn't, she agreed softly. Why are you asking about him now? Tobias was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because we're about to face Coleman, your past, and I realize there's still so much I don't know about you. Ruth looked up at him, really seeing him in the warm lantern glow. This man who had become so central to her life, yet with whom she had shared so little of her deeper self. What do you want to know? She asked. Whatever you are willing to tell me. His eyes held hers steadily. Not because I need to know, because I want to understand. Ruth considered this, the offer behind the simple request. In the months since their conversation in this same barn during the bitter cold of January, they had moved toward each other cautiously, the physical distance between them gradually diminishing, touches becoming more frequent, less hesitant, but the deeper intimacy of shared histories, of revealed vulnerabilities, that remained largely unexplored. I loved him, she said finally, the admission painful even after so many years. At the beginning, he was handsome, strong. When he smiled at me, I felt, she shook her head at the memory, special, chosen. Tobias listened without interruption, his expression open, non-judgmental. The changes came slowly, Ruth continued, a harsh word here, a grip too tight there, always followed by apologies, by tenderness. Her voice hardened, until the apologies stopped, and only the cruelty remained. And you stayed, Tobias observed, not as accusation, but as recognition of a common tragedy. I stayed, Ruth confirmed, for Isaac, for survival, because I believed I deserved no better. She met his eyes directly. I won't make that mistake again. With anyone. Good, Tobias said simply. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond its brevity. Ruth found herself stepping closer, drawn by the quiet certainty in his gaze. I'm not her anymore, she said softly. That girl who believed love meant endurance, suffering. No, Tobias agreed. You're Ruth, who survived, who protects, who builds. He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and touched her cheek with gentle fingers. Ruth didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the contact, allowing herself to acknowledge the warmth it kindled within her. When this trial is over, she began, when Coleman is sentenced and we return to Build Haven. Yes, Tobias prompted when she hesitated. I'd like us to begin again, Ruth said, not as a woman purchased from a cage and the man who bought her, but as Ruth and Tobias, choosing each other freely. The smile that transformed his weathered face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I'd like that too. With slow deliberation, Ruth closed the remaining distance between them. Their kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise rather than a demand, a beginning rather than an end. When they separated, Ruth felt a curious lightness, as if some long-carried burden had been set down at last. We should rest, Tobias said, though his hand remained linked with hers. Long journey tomorrow. Ruth nodded, but neither moved immediately, both savoring this moment of quiet connection before the challenges that lay ahead. Fort Benton perched on the banks of the Missouri River, the last outpost of American law before the vast northern territories. Originally a fur trading post, it had grown into a bustling hub where riverboats from St. Louis disgorged their cargoes of goods and humanity bound for the Montana goldfields. Ruth and Tobias arrived after 5 days of hard travel, dust-covered and weary. Marshal Davis met them at the ferry landing, his normally composed face tight with concern. Thank God you're here, he greeted them, helping unload their modest baggage. Things have developed since I telegraphed. Coleman? Ruth asked immediately. Davis nodded grimly. His allies have been busy. 2 key witnesses have withdrawn their testimonies. Another was found dead in his hotel room. Natural causes, supposedly. And Sarah? Tobias pressed. Safe, under guard at the courthouse, but isolated. Davis lowered his voice. They're trying to have her declared incompetent before she can testify. Claiming her years in the asylum have rendered her statements unreliable. Ruth's expression hardened. They won't succeed. No, Davis agreed, but they're creating delays, procedural obstacles. The trial that should have started yesterday is now postponed until next week, giving them more time to pressure witnesses, Tobias concluded. Exactly. Davis gestured them toward a waiting carriage. I've arranged rooms for you at the River Hotel, under different names for safety. As they drove through Fort Benton's muddy streets, Ruth observed the frontier town with wary eyes. Despite its growth, it retained the rough-edged impermanence of a place where fortunes were made and lost overnight, where loyalty was as fluid as the river itself. Who's presiding over the trial? Tobias asked. Judge Lawrence from the Eastern District, Davis replied. Brought in specially. Good man, incorruptible. He hesitated, but limited in his power. Coleman's attorneys are filing motions in multiple jurisdictions, seeking to have the case move to more favorable venues. How can we help? Ruth asked directly. Davis considered her question. Stay visible. Let Coleman's people see you're not intimidated, but be careful. There are hired guns in town, watching and waiting. Nothing new there, Ruth observed dryly. At the hotel, they were shown to adjoining rooms overlooking the river. Davis left them to settle in, promising to return with further updates that evening. Alone at last, Ruth moved to the window, studying the busy street below. Miners, traders, riverboat men, and the women who catered to them flowed along the boardwalks in a continuous stream of humanity. Somewhere among them were Coleman's allies, watching, waiting for an opportunity. A knock at the connecting door announced Tobias. Everything all right? He asked, noting her stance by the window. Just getting my bearings, she replied. Old habits. He nodded in understanding. Davis left these. He held up a stack of papers, testimony transcripts, updates on the case. Ruth joined him at the small table where he'd spread the documents. Together they read through the accumulated evidence against Coleman, financial records showing bribes and kickbacks, witness statements detailing intimidation and violence, land transactions revealing the pattern of forced sales Sarah had warned them about. It's all here, Ruth said finally. Everything we suspected and more. And yet he might still escape justice, Tobias observed grimly. With enough money, enough powerful friends. No, Hatta, Ruth's voice was steel. Not this time. Before Tobias could respond, another knock came, this time at the hallway door. Ruth tensed, hand moving instinctively to the knife concealed in her boot. Mrs. Granger, a female voice called softly. It's Elizabeth Carter. Marshal Davis sent me. Ruth exchanged glances with Tobias, who moved to position himself beside the door, out of sight but ready to intervene. Enter, Ruth called. The door opened to reveal a slender woman in her 30s, dressed in the simple but elegant attire of a schoolteacher or government clerk. Her intelligent eyes swept the room quickly before settling on Ruth. Thank you for seeing me, she said, stepping inside and closing the door firmly behind her. I represent the Women's Christian Temperance Union of Montana Territory. Ruth raised an eyebrow, surprised. The WCTU was known primarily for its anti-alcohol crusades, though Ruth had heard they were increasingly involved in broader social reforms. How can I help you, Mrs. Carter? She asked cautiously. It's Miss, the woman corrected, and it's we who wish to help you. She glanced at Tobias, clearly assessing his presence. Both of you. Go on, Tobias encouraged. Elizabeth Carter set down her handbag and removed her gloves with practiced precision. Our organization has been monitoring Judge Coleman's activities for some time. His treatment of women, particularly those who came before his court on domestic matters, has been concerning. That's one word for it, Ruth commented dryly. Indeed. Elizabeth's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing genuine anger beneath. We have assembled testimonies from 27 women who suffered directly from his rulings. Wives returned to abusive husbands. Mothers denied custody of their children on spurious grounds. Women committed to asylums for hysteria when they dared challenge their husband's authority. Ruth felt a chill at this last category, remembering Sarah Coleman's imprisonment. These testimonies, Tobias asked, are they part of the current case? Elizabeth shook her head. Many of the women fear reprisals if they come forward officially. Others have been threatened into silence. Her expression hardened. But they are willing to speak now publicly, if given protection and a platform. What exactly are you proposing? Ruth asked. A demonstration, Elizabeth replied. Tomorrow morning, on the courthouse steps. All 27 women, plus supporters from our organization and allied groups, showing solidarity with Sarah Coleman and with you, Mrs. Granger. Ruth considered the proposal. Public demonstrations weren't uncommon in territorial politics, but they rarely changed judicial outcomes directly. How would this help the case? She questioned. By changing the narrative, Elizabeth explained passionately. Right now, Coleman's attorneys are portraying this as a simple criminal matter. Unfortunate but isolated incidents involving a respected judge. We want to show it's part of a pattern, a systemic abuse of power targeting the most vulnerable. Tobias nodded slowly. Public opinion matters, especially in a small community like Fort Benton. If enough respectable citizens take a stand, exactly, Elizabeth confirmed, Judge Lawrence may be bound by legal procedure in court, but he's not immune to public sentiment. Ruth paced the small room, weighing options and risks. Coleman's allies won't stand idle. There could be violence. We're prepared for that possibility, Elizabeth assured Hare. Many of our members have husbands or brothers in law enforcement, and Marshal Davis has already offered unofficial support. After further discussion of logistics and security measures, Ruth made her decision. I'll participate, she said, but I want to meet these women first. Hear their stories directly. Of course, Elizabeth agreed readily. They're gathered at our meeting hall now. I can take you there immediately if you wish. Ruth glanced at Tobias, who nodded his support. Lead the way, Miss Carter. When the WCTU meeting hall proved to be a modest building near the Methodist Church, its interior warm and surprisingly crowded despite the late hour. Women of all ages and social classes filled the room, their conversations falling silent as Ruth entered with Elizabeth and Tobias. Ladies, Elizabeth announced, this is Ruth Granger and her husband Tobias. They've agreed to join our demonstration tomorrow. For a moment, no one moved. Then an older woman with silver hair and aristocratic bearing approached Ruth, her hand extended. Margaret Hollister, she introduced herself. My daughter Charlotte was declared mentally unfit and committed to an asylum when she sought divorce from her abusive husband. Judge Coleman presided over the hearing. One by one, the women came forward, each with a similar story. Justice denied, lives destroyed, all through Coleman's deliberate manipulation of the law. Ruth listened intently, recognizing in each account echoes of her own experience, of Sarah's suffering. Your courage in testifying against him gives us hope, a young widow told Ruth, her eyes bright with unshed tears. If he can be brought down, perhaps others will think twice before abusing their power. The meeting continued well into the night, strategies discussed, risks assessed, courage bolstered. When Ruth and Tobias finally returned to their hotel, the first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern sky. Will it make a difference? Ruth wondered aloud as they paused outside her door. It already has, Tobias replied. For those women, for you. She nodded, understanding his meaning. The isolation that had defined her existence for so long, first in Caleb's control, then in Coleman's cage, then in years of running, was truly breaking. Connection by connection, alliance by alliance, she was becoming part of something larger than her own survival. Get some rest, Tobias advised. Tomorrow will test us all. The courthouse square filled early the next morning, a crowd gathering despite the chill spring air. As promised, Elizabeth Carter had assembled an impressive showing, not just the 27 women with direct grievances against Coleman, but supporters from throughout the territory. Miners' wives stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants' daughters and ranch women, all united by common cause. Ruth watched from the hotel window as Marshal Davis and his deputies established a perimeter, their presence both reassurance and warning. On the opposite side of the square, a smaller group had gathered, well-dressed men whom Ruth recognized as Coleman's attorneys, accompanied by hired muscle attempting to look inconspicuous and failing. Ready? Tobias asked from the doorway. Ruth turned to face him, adjusting the simple dark dress Elizabeth had provided. Respectable attire deemed appropriate for the occasion. Yes, she said, the single word carrying resolve beyond its brevity. They descended to the lobby, where Elizabeth waited with several WCTU members. The women formed a protective circle around Ruth as they exited the hotel and crossed toward the courthouse, their organized procession drawing all eyes. On the courthouse steps, Elizabeth directed the placement of participants, the 27 women in a solemn line across the middle step, supporters below with Ruth and Sarah Coleman, who had been escorted from her guarded room inside, positioned centrally. Seeing Sarah again, pale but composed in a simple gray dress, Ruth felt a surge of determination. They had both survived Coleman's attempts to silence them. They would not be silenced now. Elizabeth Carter stepped forward to address the growing crowd, her clear voice carrying across the square. We gather today in witness and in warning, she began. In witness to the suffering caused by one man's abuse of power. In warning that such abuse will no longer be tolerated in silence. As she continued, outlining Coleman's pattern of judicial misconduct, Ruth scanned the crowd. Most faces showed interest, some sympathy, other skepticism. On the fringes, Coleman's supporters watched with barely concealed hostility. Then Ruth saw him, Victor Coleman himself, emerging from a side street, flanked by attorneys and a man she recognized as Senator James Whitlock, one of the powerful figures Sarah had named in Denver. Their appearance caused a ripple through the crowd. Elizabeth faltered momentarily in her address, then continued with renewed vigor. Coleman and his entourage paused at the edge of the gathering, clearly intending to intimidate through their presence alone. Sarah tensed beside Ruth, her breath quickening. Ruth reached for her hand, a silent gesture of support that Sarah accepted gratefully. "Be strong," Ruth murmured. "He has no power here." As if hearing her words across the distance, Coleman's gaze found Ruth's. For an instant, their eyes locked, the man who had caged her and the woman who had survived. Ruth did not look away, did not flinch. She stood tall, unflinching, her very presence a refutation of his authority. Elizabeth concluded her speech to scattered applause, then introduced Margaret Hollister, who stepped forward to share her daughter's story. One by one, women came forward, each mothers, daughters, sisters, each testimony building on the last, creating a damning pattern that even Coleman's most ardent supporters would find difficult to dismiss. When it was Ruth's turn to speak, she moved to the center of the steps with deliberate calm. The crowd hushed, anticipation palpable. Coleman and his group had edged closer, within clear hearing distance. "My name is Ruth Mercer Granger," she began, her voice strong and steady. "7 years ago, Judge Victor Coleman sentenced me to imprisonment for a crime I did not commit. When that imprisonment failed to break me, he had me placed in a cage and exhibited like an animal." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ruth continued, detailing Coleman's crimes with unflinching precision. The poisoning of his wife, the murder of her son, the years of pursuit and persecution. "I stand before you not just as one woman seeking justice, but as witness to a system that protects powerful men at the expense of those they harm." Her eyes found Coleman in the crowd. No more cages, no more silence, no more impunity for those who abuse their power. As she stepped back, the crowd erupted, some in support, others in angry denial. Coleman's face had darkened with rage, his careful public mask slipping to reveal the cruelty beneath. What happened next unfolded with frightening speed. One of Coleman's men surged forward, hand moving toward his coat. Marshal Davis shouted a warning. Tobias lunged toward Ruth. The crack of a pistol shot froze everyone in place. Ruth turned toward the sound, expecting to see violence erupting, but instead witnessed an astonishing tableau. Senator Whitlock stood with a smoking gun pointed skyward, his face contorted with fury. Not at Ruth or the demonstrators, but at Coleman. "Enough," he roared. "You promised this would be handled discreetly, Victor, that no one would be harmed." Coleman's expression shifted rapidly from rage to calculation. "James, don't be a fool. Lower your weapon." "I've been the fool," Whitlock replied, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Believing your lies, protecting you, no more." Marshal Davis moved cautiously forward. "Senator, please lower your weapon." Whitlock complied slowly, his eyes never leaving Coleman. "Arrest him, Marshal, before he destroys us all." "I have a warrant," Davis confirmed, signaling his deputies forward. "Judge Coleman, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and tampering with witnesses." As the deputies moved to take Coleman into custody, he made one desperate lunge toward Ruth. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You'll never be free of me." Ruth met his gaze steadily. "I already am." The crowd parted as Coleman was led away, his once imposing figure diminished by the public spectacle of his arrest. Senator Whitlock surrendered his weapon to Marshal Davis, his aristocratic features haggard with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Mrs. Granger," he said as he passed Ruth, "I owe you an apology that can never be adequate. I believed his lies about you, about his wife." He glanced towards Sarah, who watched him with undisguised contempt. "I have made a statement to Marshal Davis, names, dates, transactions. Everything I know about the land purchases." Ruth regarded him with measured caution. "Why now?" "Because there are lines even ambitious men shouldn't cross," he replied. "Coleman crossed them long ago. I looked away. No more." As Whitlock was escorted away for formal questioning, Ruth found herself surrounded by women from the demonstration. Some tearful, others jubilant, all sharing in the catharsis of the moment. Sarah approached, her face alight with vindication. "It's really happening," she said wonderingly, "after all these years." "Yes," Ruth affirmed, embracing her former ally. "Justice, finally." Tobias joined them, his expression a mix of relief and wariness. "It's not over yet," he cautioned. "The trial still needs to proceed." "It will," Marshal Davis assured them, returning from overseeing Coleman's processing. "Whitlock's testimony changes everything. He's naming names, confirming the conspiracy Sarah uncovered." "And Coleman's other allies?" Ruth asked. "Scattering like rats from a sinking ship," Davis reported, with grim satisfaction. "Self-preservation is a powerful motivator for men like that." As the crowd began to disperse, Elizabeth Carter approached with news that the judge had agreed to meet with a delegation of WCTU women to hear their concerns directly. "Will you join us, Mrs. Granger?" she asked. "Your voice would carry particular weight." Ruth glanced at Tobias, who nodded encouragement. "Go," he said simply. "I'll meet you back at the hotel." The meeting with Judge Lawrence lasted well into the afternoon, the women presenting not just their grievances, but concrete proposals for judicial reform, greater protections for wives seeking divorce from abusive husbands, stricter oversight of commitment procedures, more transparent land claim processes. The judge, a thoughtful man with decades of legal experience, listened attentively, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions. "The law is imperfect," he acknowledged as the meeting concluded, "too often shaped by those with power to serve their own interests. But it can change. It must change." He looked directly at Ruth. "Your testimony at Coleman's trial will be crucial in that process." "I'll be there," she promised. By the time Ruth returned to the hotel, the sun was setting over the Missouri River, painting the muddy waters with streaks of gold and crimson. She found Tobias on the small balcony outside his room, watching the riverboats dock for the night. "You missed quite a day," she observed, joining him at the railing. "I heard," he replied with a small smile. "The whole town's talking about nothing else. Senator Whitlock's confession, Coleman's arrest, the women who stood against them both." Ruth accepted the compliment with a nod, still unused to recognition that didn't carry fear or suspicion. "Davis came by earlier," Tobias continued. "Coleman's trial begins Monday. No more delays," and he hesitated, then smiled fully. "He had news from the ranch. A telegram from Samuel." Ruth turned to him quickly. "Isaac?" "Is fine," Tobias assured her immediately. "More than fine. The telegram was mostly about Haven, actually. The first permanent structures are underway. The Wheelers have officially joined as founders, along with 3 families from Silver Creek." "Already?" Ruth was surprised by the rapid developments. "Word travels fast," Tobias explained, "especially news of Coleman's downfall. People who feared him are finding their courage." Ruth absorbed this, the reality of their vision taking tangible form even in their absence. "We should be there," she said softly, "helping build." "We will be," Tobias promised, "once this is finished." He covered her hand with his own where it rested on the railing, one ending before the next beginning. They stood together as darkness settled over Fort Benton, the lights of the town reflecting in the river below. Ruth felt an unfamiliar peace settling within her, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose, of connection, of hope. "What are you thinking?" Tobias asked after a comfortable silence. Ruth considered her answer carefully. "That freedom isn't just about broken chains," she said finally. "It's about what you build afterward." He nodded, understanding. "Haven." "Yes," she agreed, "but not just the place, the idea, the possibility that we can create something better than what came before." Tobias turned to face her fully, his expression serious yet tender. "Together?" Ruth met his gaze steadily, no longer afraid of the vulnerability it represented. "Together," she confirmed. As they sealed this renewed promise with a kiss, Ruth thought of Isaac waiting at the ranch, of Sarah soon to be freed from her long captivity, of the women who had stood with her that day, of all the broken people finding strength and unity, creating family from the fragments of shattered lives. The cage that had once defined her was long gone, its bars melted down and reforged into something stronger, more enduring. Not walls to confine, but foundations to build upon. Whatever trials tomorrow might bring, Ruth would face them not as a woman alone, but as part of something larger, something growing, something free. Haven awaited, and with it, home.